What if everything you thought you knew about history was wrong? Across centuries, stories have been carved into stone, whispered through empires, printed in textbooks, and passed from generation to generation. But history, as we know it, is not always history as it happened. Somewhere between truth and tale, reality was bent, deliberately reshaped or quietly distorted. The victors wrote their triumphs, the myths became monuments, and we believed. Imagine discovering that ancient statues were never white marble, but painted in vivid, lifelike color, that the image of a horned Viking warrior was a fiction born of costume drama, or that a single phrase, never actually spoken, was enough to damn a queen in the eyes of the world. These aren't just mistakes. They're carefully constructed illusions, fossilized into our collective memory. So why were we told these lies? Who stood to gain? And how many more truths are still buried beneath the surface? Tonight, we peel back the polished layers of our past and expose the forgotten, the rewritten, and the misremembered. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into the historical lies we believed for far too long. For generations, we were taught, sometimes in textbooks, sometimes through movies and popular stories, that the Great Pyramids of Giza were built by slaves. A vivid image takes shape in the mind's eye. Endless lines of shackled men, laboring beneath a scorching sun, driven by the whip and the will of a pharaoh. It is a powerful picture, one that evokes suffering, tyranny, and the grandeur of a civilization built on the broken backs of the oppressed. But is it true? The idea of slave labor constructing the pyramids is deeply rooted in modern consciousness, not necessarily because of Egyptian records, but due to centuries of interpretation, storytelling, and even religious tradition. The Book of Exodus describes the Hebrews enslaved in Egypt, and for many, this narrative seamlessly merged with the construction of the pyramids in imagination, despite the fact that the timeline doesn't quite align. The pyramids of Giza were built around 2600 to 2500 BC, while most scholars place the events of the Exodus, if historical at all, much later. So where does the truth lie? Over the past few decades, archaeology has slowly shifted the sands of understanding. Excavations around the Giza Plateau have uncovered something quietly revolutionary, evidence not of slaves but of skilled laborers. Workers' villages, complete with housing, tools, and food supplies, suggest something far more complex than forced servitude. The bones found at nearby burial sites don't show signs of chronic malnutrition or abuse, but rather show signs of medical care and repetitive stress injuries, markers of hard labor, yes, but labor that was valued. Imagine this scene instead. Teams of organized workers, artisans, stonecutters, and laborers toiling with determination and pride. Not shackled, but part of a national project, one that might have had spiritual or symbolic meaning beyond mere construction. Their diets included meat, beef and fish in particular, a luxury not typically afforded to slaves. Their tombs were placed near the very monuments they helped raise, a mark of honor in the shadow of eternity. Could it be that these pyramids were not only marvels of engineering, but monuments to a coordinated, motivated society, not one built on chains? This newer understanding paints a picture, not of oppression, but of structure. There were likely different classes of workers, permanent craftsmen who lived near the pyramids year-round, and rotating crews of seasonal laborers, perhaps participating in a kind of national duty. Egyptologist Mark Lehner, whose work at Giza helped uncover these laborers' quarters, refers to them not as slaves, but as workers with dignity. Still, myths are resilient. Hollywood has played no small role in keeping the old narrative alive. From early black and white epics to modern animations, the image of the enslaved pyramid builder remains an easy shorthand for injustice, one that fits neatly into dramatic storytelling. It's a visual too stark and symbolic to resist, a towering monument and the humbled masses beneath it. And yet, with each new discovery, we're reminded that history is not static. It shifts, not just with what we find in the earth, but with how we choose to interpret the past. Why, then, did this lie persist for so long? Perhaps because it appealed to our sense of moral clarity. The idea of unjust suffering shaping greatness is a theme that resonates across cultures. Or perhaps it served as a warning, a cautionary tale about power and cruelty. But as we peel back the layers of assumption, we see that truth is often more nuanced than we expect. The people who built the pyramids were not faceless slaves, but citizens of a vast, complex society, each contributing to something meant to last forever. And in a way, it did. The pyramids still stand, silent, majestic, immovable. They keep their secrets well. But among the windswept ruins and sunlit stones, the stories they whisper are slowly changing. What once was told in the language of chains and suffering may now be retold in the language of labor, coordination, and purpose. And so we ask, how many other monuments of history have we misunderstood? How many stories have we inherited not from evidence but from repetition? As the sun sets over Giza and the shadow of the Great Pyramid stretches long across the desert, we are left not with final answers but with better questions. The kind that turn softly in the quiet of the night. The kind that remind us that history, like sand, is always shifting, waiting for someone to look again. As the last grains of sand settled around the ancient pyramids, we turned a corner in time, leaving behind the golden deserts of Egypt and stepping across oceans to the vast, uncharted waters of the Atlantic. Here, another familiar tale waits quietly to be re-examined. A story told in classrooms, carved into monuments, and celebrated with holidays. We've all heard it before. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, a simple rhyme engraved in childhood memory. Christopher Columbus, bold, determined, and fearless, setting sail into the unknown and discovering a new world. For centuries, that story stood tall in Western history, like a pillar of national pride and exploration. But beneath the rhyme and beneath the myth, the truth is softer, subtler, and far more complex. Columbus did sail in 1492. That part is true. He commanded 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and crossed the Atlantic under the Spanish flag. But he did not, as generations were taught, discover America. When he landed on the shores of the Caribbean, there were already people there, civilizations that had flourished for thousands of years, cultures rich with art, language, trade, and memory. Columbus didn't stumble upon an empty continent. He stepped into a world already full, and even before him, others had come. Archaeological evidence now strongly supports the presence of Norse explorers in North America around the year 1000, nearly 5 centuries before Columbus. At Lonzo Meadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland, the remains of a Viking settlement quietly defy the narrative. Wooden structures, tools, and fire pits mark the place where Leif Erikson and his companions likely stayed. Their journey, though less romanticized, is no less real. But even the Vikings weren't the first. The land had long been home to indigenous peoples, the ancestors of the Iroquois, the Pueblo, the Sioux, the Maya, the Inca, the Taino. Nations with knowledge of astronomy, agriculture, architecture. Nations with origin stories, heroes, and sacred landscapes. Can one truly discover a place already known, already cherished? Still, the myth endured. Why? Perhaps because history, especially when written by those in power, is not always about facts. It's about narratives. Columbus's voyage was a turning point for Europe, a spark that ignited an era of global exploration, colonization, and empire building. To the European imagination, he opened a door to something vast and promising. His name became synonymous with adventure and conquest, and in the process, the stories of those who had come before, or who were already there, faded into the margins. For centuries, school children were taught that Columbus was a solitary light in the darkness of the unknown, that he proved the world was round, that he defied superstition and opened the future. But the world wasn't flat in 1492. Most educated people knew it was round. What Columbus underestimated was the size of the Earth and what lay between Europe and Asia. When he landed in the Caribbean, he believed he had reached islands near India. He called the people he met Indians, a name that still echoes inaccurately through time. And yet he persisted, returning on subsequent voyages, not to explore, but to conquer. What followed was not discovery, but devastation. Entire cultures unraveled under the weight of disease, forced labor, and displacement. And still, statues were raised. Streets and cities took his name. A federal holiday in the United States enshrined his place in public memory. The myth of Columbus as the discoverer of America became a cornerstone in the foundation of modern national identity, an origin story that conveniently overlooked its darker chapters. But myths, like maps, are made to be redrawn. In recent decades, a quiet shift has begun. Scholars, educators, and communities have looked again at the records, at the evidence, and at the voices long ignored. Some now mark October not as Columbus Day, but as Indigenous Peoples Day, a small but powerful gesture, recognizing the truth that the land was never lost, never waiting to be found. How does a single name come to hold such weight over centuries? What stories do we choose to tell, and which ones do we quietly forget? History, after all, is not a fixed point. It's a conversation, shaped by the questions we ask and the willingness to listen. As we drift further into this sea of re-examination, we find that many of the myths we once took for granted were not malicious lies, but simplifications, easy summaries for a complicated past. They served a purpose, but eventually, they must evolve. Now, as we look back across the waves, the silhouette of Columbus's ships fades into the mist, not as symbols of pure discovery, but as vessels of a more nuanced truth. And perhaps that is the true voyage, not across the ocean, but through our understanding of the past. What else, we might ask, have we believed simply because it was easier to believe? Just as the waves of time washed away the idea of one man discovering a world already full of people, we now return to the opulence of palaces and powdered wigs, to another familiar tale that, like many, may have echoed more loudly than it deserved. It is not about exploration this time, but about indifference. About a phrase that has survived the centuries as a symbol of cruelty and disconnect. Let them eat cake. 4 words. Simple, scornful, unforgettable. They've echoed through history like a thunderclap, held up as the ultimate example of aristocratic ignorance. The Queen, dressed in silk and surrounded by gold, dismissing the starving cries of her people with a careless suggestion. Cake, for those who couldn't even afford bread. And yet, what if she never said it? The phrase has been attributed for centuries to Marie Antoinette, the young Queen of France, during one of the nation's most turbulent periods. To many, she became the face of decadence in the years leading to the French Revolution. Her reputation was painted in extravagant hues, ballrooms, jeweled gowns, towering hairstyles, and this quote became the finishing touch. Cold, dismissive, cruel. But historical records offer a different portrait. There is no evidence, none, that Marie Antoinette ever uttered these words. No journals, no letters, no eyewitness accounts. Not even among her many critics at the time did anyone credibly accuse her of having said it. So where did the quote come from? The earliest known version of this sentiment appears not in the 18th century, but decades earlier, in the writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In his Confessions, written in the 1760s, Rousseau recalls a story from his youth in which a great princess responds to the plight of the poor with the now infamous phrase, "Let them eat brioche." He doesn't name her. He couldn't have meant Marie Antoinette. She would have been just a child at the time he was writing and hadn't yet arrived in France. So how, then, did Rousseau's literary anecdote become a weapon pointed at the Queen? In times of upheaval, stories have power. France in the late 18th century was unraveling. Bread riots, empty markets, a monarchy under pressure. In such a landscape, symbols became vital, and Marie Antoinette, already unpopular for her Austrian birth and perceived extravagance, became an easy target. The phrase fit the narrative too perfectly. Whether true or not, it served as an indictment not just of the Queen, but of an entire system believed to be out of touch, corrupt, and unsympathetic. It didn't help that the Queen had become a lightning rod for scandal. Dubbed Madame Deficit by pamphleteers, she was blamed for the kingdom's financial woes. Her personal spending, though not unprecedented for a royal, was weaponized in the public imagination. Political cartoons and satirical tracts painted her as indulgent, aloof, and even immoral. The image stuck. In this climate, "Let them eat cake" was never really about what she said. It was about what she came to represent. But who was the real Marie Antoinette? She was a teenage girl when she married into the French crown. A foreigner in a foreign court, navigating rigid customs and intense scrutiny. Letters between her and her family reveal a woman far more nuanced than the caricature history remembers. She gave to charity, adopted poor children, and was deeply involved in her own children's education. In private, she often expressed concern for the people of France, especially during times of famine and unrest. That doesn't mean she was a revolutionary, or even fully aware of the depth of suffering around her. Like many in the royal court, she lived at a distance from the realities of her people, but indifference is not the same as malice, and silence is not the same as cruelty. Still, the phrase endured, perhaps because it's so evocative, so sharply illustrative. It needs no context, no footnote. Just 4 words, and an entire world of injustice comes into focus. It's tempting, isn't it, to reduce complex histories to a single sentence, a single villain, a single cause. But the past rarely cooperates with simplicity. Even today, the myth persists, taught in schools, repeated in films, passed down through generations. Why do we hold on to it? Maybe because it offers clarity in a story full of chaos. The French Revolution was messy, brutal, and morally tangled. It's easier to believe that the people rose against a queen who sneered at their hunger than to face the layered, uncomfortable truth. That revolution is rarely clean. That change, even when necessary, is often driven by pain as well as hope. And so the myth lives on, not because it is true, but because it is useful. But what do we lose when we let myths replace reality? We lose the chance to see real people in all their contradictions. We lose the opportunity to understand, not excuse, but understand, how history is shaped by perception, repetition, and emotion. And perhaps most importantly, we lose the humility that comes with knowing we don't always know, that even the clearest stories may hold shadows beneath them. As we step out of Versailles and into the quieter corners of memory, the question lingers. How many other words were never spoken, yet shaped history all the same? From the golden halls of Versailles and the shadow of a misunderstood queen, we move now through the fog of battlefields and imperial ambition. Our next stop brings us face to face with a figure whose legend looms large, yet whose stature, in popular imagination, has somehow become small. When we hear the name Napoleon Bonaparte, a certain image often comes to mind: a military uniform, a hand tucked neatly into his coat, a piercing gaze, and, almost always, a man of unusually short height. It's one of the most persistent ideas in modern history. Napoleon, the conqueror of Europe, was not only feared, but famously small. The joke writes itself, a man compensating for his lack of physical stature with an excess of ambition and ego. So much so that Napoleon complex has entered everyday language to describe those who overreach to make up for a perceived shortcoming. But what if the foundation of that image was never true? In reality, Napoleon Bonaparte was of average height for a Frenchman of his time. Contemporary records list him at 5 feet 2 inches, but in French feet, not the English imperial system. When converted, that measurement equals approximately 5 feet 6 or 5 feet 7 inches in modern terms. Not towering, certainly, but not particularly short either. So where did the myth come from? Some of it may have begun with confusion over units of measurement. The French foot was slightly longer than the English foot, and misinterpretations in translation likely played a role. But the real fuel came from something deeper, something cultural, something political: propaganda. During the long and bitter conflict between Napoleonic France and Britain, character assassination became a powerful tool of war. British cartoonists, most notably James Gillray and George Cruikshank, often depicted Napoleon as comically small, sometimes barely the size of a child, his diminutive frame bursting with rage and arrogance. In these satirical prints, he was mocked not just as a tyrant, but as a petty, insecure man desperate for glory. The image was humorous, memorable, and contagious, and so it spread. Even as Napoleon marched across Europe, redrawing borders and rewriting histories, the idea of his supposed shortness quietly took root. By the time of his defeat and exile, the image had crystallized into popular culture. He became the small man who sought to rule the world, a contradiction so sharp it was irresistible. But those who stood beside him told a different story. Soldiers, aides, and diplomats who interacted with Napoleon described him not as unusually short, but simply unremarkable in height. He stood proudly among his men, commanding presence through intensity, charisma, and precision. It was his mind, quick, strategic, unrelenting, that set him apart, not the inches between his boots and the sky. Still, the myth endured, and perhaps it endured because it felt right. After all, isn't it easier to make sense of outsized ambition by pairing it with an inner deficiency? To explain conquests, battles, and empire building as overcompensation for something small? The idea that greatness must be driven by personal insecurity is seductive. It humanizes, it diminishes, it reassures us that even the most powerful are fragile at their core. But history is rarely that tidy. Napoleon's motivations were vast and layered, a mix of Enlightenment ideals, Corsican nationalism, personal glory, and calculated military pragmatism. He was a product of revolution and its contradictions, a man who crowned himself emperor in the name of liberty. Reducing that legacy to a matter of height is not just inaccurate, it's a distortion of complexity. Still, the power of imagery cannot be underestimated. Once embedded in the cultural imagination, these small misperceptions can echo through time more loudly than the truth itself. We see it in films, in books, in cartoons. Napoleon, short and seething. It's become a kind of shorthand, instantly recognizable, rarely questioned. And yet, it says more about us, perhaps, than it ever did about him. Why do we reach so quickly for simplifications? Why do we find comfort in shrinking giants? The idea of Napoleon's height might seem trivial compared to the weight of his impact. But small myths, repeated often enough, shape how we see the past, and in turn, how we understand power, character, and leadership. And so, as we stand at the crossroads of fact and fiction, we might pause to reflect. What other truths have we bent for the sake of a satisfying story? What details have we exaggerated or misunderstood simply because they were easier to believe? In the long march of history, even the smallest steps can change the path. As we leave behind the battlefield of myth and image that once diminished Napoleon's presence, we drift now into quieter halls, lined not with banners and medals, but chalkboards and equations. Here, too, a legend lingers, not of a general, but of a genius, and a boy who supposedly couldn't pass math. It's one of the most widely told stories in the world of education. A tale often shared to comfort struggling students or to remind us that greatness can arise from failure. The story goes like this. Albert Einstein, the very symbol of genius, the man whose name became shorthand for brilliance, once failed math as a student. It's a powerful idea, isn't it? That even someone destined to reshape our understanding of space and time once stared down a failing grade. But is it true? The simple answer is no. Einstein did not fail math. In fact, by the time he was just a teenager, he had already mastered advanced calculus and displayed an extraordinary ability to manipulate complex numbers in his head. His grades in math were consistently high, often the best in his class. Teachers and peers alike noted his unusual gifts, his appetite for abstract thought, his natural grasp of spatial reasoning, his curiosity that bordered on obsession. So how, then, did the myth begin? One possible explanation lies in a misunderstanding of grading systems. In Switzerland, where Einstein later studied, the numeric scale was reversed from what many English-speaking countries use. A 6 was the highest possible mark, and a 1 the lowest. Somewhere along the way, a report showing Einstein's top marks may have been misread, interpreting his 6 in math as a failing grade instead of an excellent one. From this simple confusion, the seed of a myth was planted. But the story grew, as myths often do, because it served a purpose. It humanized a figure who might otherwise seem untouchably brilliant. It gave hope to those who struggle with numbers, formulas, and rigid systems. It whispered that even geniuses stumble, that the road to greatness is paved with missteps. And yet, Einstein's path was not one of mathematical failure, but rather of educational friction. Though he excelled in math and physics, Einstein often clashed with the rigid and authoritarian style of his early schooling in Germany. He found little joy in rote memorization and strict discipline. He questioned his teachers. He preferred thinking to obeying. In this sense, he was a misfit, not because he lacked intellect, but because his mind wandered where the curriculum would not follow. He once remarked, "It is a miracle that curiosity survives formal education." Perhaps this is the heart of the myth's endurance. Not the idea that he was bad at math, but that he didn't quite fit in, that he wasn't the ideal student. And in that quiet rebellion, in that tension between structure and imagination, people saw something relatable, something inspiring. In truth, Einstein's academic journey was not without difficulty. He failed the entrance exam to the Zurich Polytechnic on his first attempt, not because of mathematics, but because of his weak scores in subjects like French, botany, and zoology. He would eventually gain admission, graduate, and go on to develop the theory of relativity while working at a patent office in Bern. But the details of his life, like the numbers on his report card, are more nuanced than legend often allows. The irony, of course, is that the man who supposedly failed math went on to reshape it, bending geometry to explain gravity, time, and the nature of the universe. His equations became poetry. His thoughts changed how we understand the very fabric of reality. So why do we still tell the story? Perhaps because we want to believe that genius can bloom in unexpected soil. that a struggling student today might be a world changer tomorrow, that test scores and grades are not the sum of a mind's worth. These are comforting ideas, and perhaps, in a way, they're not so far from the truth, just not in the way the myth imagines. Einstein did not fail math, but he did challenge the idea that intelligence must conform to systems. He was not a rebel for rebellion's sake, but a thinker who could not stop thinking, restless, curious, full of questions that had no easy answers. And maybe that's the quiet lesson behind the louder story. As we trace the lines between myth and memory, fact and folklore, we are reminded that the past is rarely just a list of facts. It is a story we tell ourselves, again and again, shaped by our values, our hopes, our need to find meaning. And so we pause here, with a boy who didn't fail math, but who challenged the very nature of numbers and time. And we wonder, what other stories, meant to inspire, have quietly rewritten the truth? As we leave behind the tangled tale of misunderstood grades and misplaced genius, we drift further back, into a different kind of silence. Not the silence of misunderstood individuals, but the silence left behind by a vanished world of knowledge. A single moment, they say, when the lights of ancient wisdom were forever extinguished. But was it really only one moment? For generations, the destruction of the Library of Alexandria has stood as a symbol of tragic loss, a single fire, a single night, and with it, the disappearance of centuries of human thought. Scrolls turned to ash, ideas lost forever, a calamity so great it's often described as the death of ancient knowledge itself. But is that how it really happened? This story, told and retold, paints the destruction of the library as one dramatic, cataclysmic event. Often, blame is assigned to a specific figure, Julius Caesar in 48 BC. The tale goes that during his military campaign in Egypt, Caesar ordered ships in the harbor of Alexandria to be set ablaze. The fire spread inland, consuming the grand library in its wake. A moment of unintended devastation, and the end of a golden age. It's a powerful image. But like many stories shaped by centuries of repetition, the truth is far less clear and far more nuanced. In reality, the Library of Alexandria likely did not disappear in a single night. Its end was not sudden, but slow. Not a singular flame, but a series of erosions over time, political, cultural, and practical. Founded in the 3rd century BC under the rule of Ptolemy I, the library was envisioned as a beacon of knowledge, a place where all the world's texts would be gathered, studied, translated. Scholars came from across the ancient world, Babylonia, India, Greece, to read, teach, and debate. At its height, the library may have held hundreds of thousands of scrolls, not just Greek philosophy, but Egyptian medicine, Persian astronomy, Indian mathematics, a mosaic of ancient thought. And yet, like all institutions, it was vulnerable. It's true that Caesar's fire likely caused damage, perhaps even to the library or its satellite collections near the docks. But records suggest the library continued to function in some form long after. The Greek geographer Strabo visited Alexandria more than 20 years later and described scholarly activity still taking place. Others, like Claudius Ptolemy and Galen, wrote of studying there well into the Roman period. So what happened? One answer is neglect. As political power shifted and the priorities of rulers changed, the library gradually lost its patronage. The later Roman Empire, more focused on conquest than preservation, did not maintain it with the same reverence. Some texts were removed, others were lost in periods of war or administrative reform. Another chapter in the decline came with religious transformation. As Christianity spread through the empire, tensions grew between emerging religious authority and pagan or secular knowledge. The Serapeum, once home to a branch of the library, was destroyed in 391 AD under the Christian Emperor Theodosius III during a crackdown on pagan temples. That act, more than 3 centuries after Caesar's fire, marked another quiet crumbling of what remained. And finally, the arrival of Arab forces in the 7th century brought another layer of complexity. Later Islamic sources, written centuries after the fact, describe Caliph Omar allegedly ordering the burning of the remaining scrolls. But most modern scholars regard this account as apocryphal, likely a legend that grew in hindsight to explain what had already been lost. The truth is, we don't know exactly when the library died, because it didn't die all at once. It faded, piece by piece, fire by fire, war by war, ruler by ruler. And yet, the myth of its sudden destruction persists. Why? Perhaps because the image of a single moment, a single tragic blaze, is more poetic, more tragic, easier to grasp. The slow erosion of culture is harder to mourn than its instant annihilation. And perhaps we find meaning in imagining that knowledge can vanish all at once, that it is fragile, that it needs protection. The story becomes a cautionary tale. Guard your wisdom, or lose it in an instant. But the Library of Alexandria also teaches something quieter. That knowledge is not just stored in buildings or scrolls, it lives in people, in dialogue, in translation and memory. And as long as those threads remain, not all is lost. Even today we search for traces, ancient texts copied in other cities, fragments preserved by chance, ideas that survived through oral tradition. In that search, we realize that history is not about perfect preservation. It is about rediscovery. And so we sit with the silence of Alexandria, not as a monument to what was suddenly destroyed, but as a whisper of what once was and might still be found. What other stories, we might wonder, have we shaped into sharp endings, when in truth they simply faded into the quiet folds of time? From the ashes of Alexandria and the quiet fading of the ancient world, we drift now into colder lands, wind-swept coasts, icy fjords, and longships cutting through the mist. And in the fog of memory, another image emerges, familiar, striking, and just a little theatrical. A Viking warrior, fierce-eyed and battle-ready, with horns rising from his helmet like the crown of a beast. It's a powerful picture. But it was never quite real. The myth of the horned Viking helmet is so deeply embedded in our cultural imagination that it feels almost unquestionable. From children's books to Halloween costumes, opera stages to sports team mascots, we've long pictured Norse raiders wearing curved, pointed horns atop their heads, like warriors from some mythic realm. But is that how they really looked? In truth, no archaeological discovery has ever uncovered a Viking helmet with horns. None. Helmets found in burial sites, such as the well-known Geirmundbu helmet in Norway, are practical, utilitarian, and entirely hornless. Made of iron, rounded to deflect blows, and sometimes adorned with a nose guard, these helmets were designed for protection, not pageantry. So where did the horns come from? Like many persistent myths, this one finds its roots not in history, but in art, and in the stories we chose to tell centuries later. In the 19th century, a romanticized view of the Viking Age began to take shape, fueled by national pride, literature, and opera. Artists sought to evoke an image of wild, untamed northern warriors, brutal yet noble, barbaric yet majestic. Enter the stage designer. When Richard Wagner's Der Ring des Nibelungen premiered in the late 1800s, costume designer Karl Emil Doppler outfitted his Viking-inspired characters with dramatic horned helmets. The effect was striking, audiences were captivated, and a legend was born, not from battlefield accounts or ancient sagas, but from the flicker of gaslights on a theatrical stage. This visual idea took hold quickly. Illustrations followed, then paintings, advertisements, cartoons. The image of the horned Viking became iconic, almost mythological. And like all good myths, it offered something deeper than mere decoration. The horns became a symbol of savagery, of otherness, of raw primal force. But the real Vikings, like most people in history, were far more complex. They were traders and explorers, craftsmen and settlers. They crossed seas, built towns, carved runes, and held legal assemblies. Yes, they raided, but they also built. They navigated rivers into the heart of Europe and sailed to distant lands, including parts of North America centuries before Columbus. Their society was rich in poetry, mythology, and social codes. The horned helmet tells only a narrow story, and not an accurate one. It's worth noting that horned helmets did exist in ancient history, just not among the Vikings. Ritualistic helmets with horns have been found in Bronze Age Europe, used in ceremonies rather than war. To wear horns in battle would be impractical. They catch weapons. They unbalance the head. They invite danger rather than deflect it. Real warriors chose function over flair. And yet, the image of the horned Viking persists. Why? Perhaps because it's dramatic, memorable, a little bit fearsome, a little bit theatrical. It fits the archetype of the wild barbarian storming the gates of civilization, a figure that Europe, for centuries, both feared and fantasized about. It also simplifies identity, reducing a diverse and nuanced culture to a single visual shorthand. And as with many historical simplifications, it tells us more about the people who invented it than the people it supposedly describes. The 19th century was an age of myth-making. Nations were being formed. Histories were being rewritten. In this climate, the past became a canvas onto which artists and thinkers projected ideals, fears, and fantasies. The Viking, reborn with horns, was no longer a historical figure. He was a symbol of strength, a mascot for cultural memory. But what happens when those symbols obscure the truth? When we look back on the Viking Age, not through the mist of theatrical costume, but through the lens of archaeology and primary sources, we find something richer, a people connected to the world around them, navigating both war and peace. A culture whose impact on Europe was not merely destructive, but deeply transformative. And so we pause at the edge of this myth, not to discard it entirely, but to see it for what it is, a story layered upon a story. The horned helmet may not belong to the past, but it does belong to our imagination of the past. And in understanding how it got there, we glimpse the quiet ways history is shaped, not just by facts, but by fantasy. How many other details have we accepted simply because they looked good in a painting, on a stage, or in a tale told too many times? As we take one last look at the imagined Viking, horns gleaming in the fog, we are reminded that the past is often stranger, simpler, and more human than the myths we use to decorate it. From the windswept shores of Scandinavia and the imagined horns of Viking helmets, we journey eastward, far across continents, past deserts and mountains, to a wall so vast, so enduring, that it has long been said you could see it from space. A marvel of human labor, a testament to ambition and fear. But as we now know, even the greatest monuments are not always as visible or as simple as legend would have us believe. For generations, students, tourists, and even astronauts have repeated the same extraordinary claim. The Great Wall of China is the only man-made object visible from space. It's a statement filled with awe, reverence, and a touch of national pride. What structure could be more deserving of such distinction? Stretching over 13,000 miles across northern China, this ancient fortification has wound its way into both geography and imagination. But the view from space tells a quieter story. The truth is that, from low Earth orbit, the same orbit where the International Space Station circles our planet, it is very difficult to see the Great Wall of China with the naked eye. Not because it isn't long, but because it isn't especially wide. On average, the wall is only about 30 feet across. Its materials, stone, brick, and tamped earth, blend in naturally with the surrounding landscape. And when viewed from hundreds of kilometers above the Earth, human-made features become almost indistinguishable from the patterns of nature itself. So where did this myth begin? The earliest known version predates spaceflight. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Western travelers and scholars, awed by tales of the wall, began to speculate that such an immense construction must surely be visible from the moon. This assumption was repeated, expanded, and passed along in books, lectures, and magazines, often by those who had never visited China, and certainly not space. Even when space travel became a reality, the story lingered. In 2003, China's first astronaut, Yang Liwei, completed a historic mission. Upon returning, he was asked whether he had seen the wall from orbit. His answer was clear: no. The claim was quietly corrected in official records, but the popular myth endured. Why? Perhaps because the idea is comforting, that something built by human hands long ago still speaks to the stars, that we have shaped the earth in a way that echoes beyond our sky. There's something poetic in imagining a wall that defends not only against invaders, but against the forgetting of history itself. And the wall is worth remembering. Construction began as early as the 7th century BC, but the most iconic sections, like those near Beijing, were built during the Ming Dynasty between the 14th and 17th centuries. It was never a single continuous wall, but a vast network of walls, watchtowers, fortresses, and natural barriers, adjusted and rebuilt across dynasties. It represented not just a line of defense, but a political boundary, a symbol of unity and endurance. But like all things mythologized, it has been shaped as much by story as by stone. Even today, parts of the wall have crumbled into dust. Others have been rebuilt with modern materials to serve tourism rather than defense. And yet, its legend remains intact, visible not in the sky but in textbooks, travel posters, and memory. We often want the physical world to mirror our grandest ideas, to believe that what is vast must also be visible, that what is ancient must also be immortal. But space, like time, is not always accommodating. From above, Earth becomes texture, soft, blurred without sharp edges. Forests become brushstrokes, rivers, threads. Cities disappear under clouds. Even the pyramids fade into the folds of the desert. And yet, in that quiet view from orbit, something else emerges. The realization that human greatness doesn't always leave bold lines. Sometimes, it leaves stories. The myth of the wall's visibility may be false in a literal sense, but in another way it speaks to something enduring, the desire to connect, to be remembered, to mark our place on the earth in ways that might outlast us. So we ask, what other monuments have we misunderstood? What other truths have we folded into legend until the line between fact and feeling became soft? As we continue this journey through the myths of history, the Great Wall invites us to look not just up to the stars, but back down to earth, with gentler eyes and a deeper sense of wonder for what truly lasts. From the winding stone of a distant wall, once believed visible from the stars, we move now to a narrow pass between sea and mountain, a place etched deep into the Western imagination, Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, a name that still evokes courage, sacrifice, and impossible odds. But here too, beneath the legend, history tells a quieter, more complex tale. We've all heard the story. 300 Spartans, led by King Leonidas, stood alone against the vast Persian army at Thermopylae in 480 BC. Outnumbered by tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, they fought with unmatched bravery. They held the line. They died to the last man. And in doing so, they bought time for Greece and for the future of the Western world. It's a powerful story, a symbol of valor in the face of certain death, of defiance, honor, and heroic sacrifice. But they did not fight alone. The Battle of Thermopylae, while remembered as the story of 300 Spartans, was far more than a single city's stand. In reality, the Greek force that assembled to delay the Persian invasion numbered closer to 7,000 men at its peak. Alongside the Spartans were soldiers from Thespiae, Thebes, Corinth, Phocis, and other city-states, men who also fought, who also died, but whose names have largely been eclipsed by the Spartan legend. Why then do we remember the 300 and forget the rest? Part of the answer lies in the nature of myth. The story of a small, elite band of warriors holding back an empire is simple, striking, and unforgettable. It resonates across time because it speaks to something primal, the idea that courage alone can defy fate, that a few, standing firm, can change the course of history. And Sparta, even in its own time, was no ordinary city. It was built around the concept of warfare. From childhood, Spartan boys were trained to endure pain, resist fear, and fight without hesitation. The image of 300 Spartans facing death was not just a tale of bravery, it was a statement of identity, a distilled symbol of what it meant to be Spartan. Yet the reality, as always, is more layered. The Persian invasion, led by King Xerxes, was one of the largest military campaigns of the ancient world. Greece stood divided, fractured into rival city-states. But as the Persian threat loomed, some of these cities chose to unite, however uneasily, to defend their land. The narrow coastal pass at Thermopylae was chosen as the place to make a stand. There, geography could offset numbers. The path was too narrow for the Persians to fully deploy their army. It was a choke point, a strategic bottleneck. And for 2 days, the Greeks held the line. It wasn't just the Spartans. Thespians fought with determination. Thebans too, though their loyalty is debated. Phocians were stationed on the heights to guard against a flanking maneuver. Together, they resisted wave after wave of attack. The Persians, despite their numbers, could not break through. But then came betrayal. A local named Ephialtes revealed a hidden mountain path to the Persians, a route that would allow them to circle behind the Greek forces. Leonidas, learning of this encirclement, made a decision. He dismissed most of the Greek army, knowing the battle was lost. He chose to stay, and with him remained his 300 Spartans, as well as 700 Thespians and a small contingent of Thebans. These men made a final stand, not just Spartans, but allies too, whose names history has nearly forgotten. It is these last hours that gave rise to the legend. A handful of men against an empire, a choice to die rather than retreat. Their bodies, later found still guarding the path, became a symbol not just of resistance, but of principle. And yet, how often do we hear of the Thespians, of the others who stayed? The answer may lie in what we choose to remember. The Spartan's tale fit neatly into the heroic mold. It was retold by Herodotus, the father of history, and carried through centuries of storytelling. Later, during times of war and crisis, their story was resurrected again and again. During World War II, it was invoked as a symbol of holding the line against tyranny. In modern cinema, stylized depictions of the battle turned history into theater. Black capes, glistening muscles, bronze helmets, and slow-motion valor. But in making the story iconic, we also made it smaller. We edited the scene, cropping out the allied Greeks, the layers of politics, the strategic decisions. We simplified the past into something easier to carry, easier to use. It's a pattern we've seen before, and will see again. History often favors symbols over substance. One moment, one quote, one number. 300 is easier to remember than 7,000. It makes the tale cleaner, the lesson clearer. But clarity comes at a cost. Because when we strip away the others, we lose something. We lose the full scope of cooperation that Thermopylae represented. We lose the idea that courage was not the property of a single city-state, but a shared human choice. We lose the story of those who stood beside the Spartans, not for glory, but because they believed the fight mattered. And we're left with a question that echoes beyond the pass. What does it mean to remember? To tell the truth of Thermopylae is not to diminish the Spartans. Their bravery is real, their discipline unmatched. But to remember only them is to miss the wider meaning of that moment. A moment where fractured peoples stood together, where some stayed to die so that others could prepare to fight again. As the sun rises over the narrow cliffs and sea beside Thermopylae, we can still hear the silence left by those who fell. Not just 300 voices, but hundreds more, quiet now, waiting to be remembered. And so we ask, what other names have we left behind in the shadows of our most cherished myths? As the cries of battle fade from the cliffs of Thermopylae and the last defenders fall into legend, we travel now from the mountains of ancient Greece to the quiet halls of early America. From one myth of valor to another, this one far smaller in scale, but still lodged deep in public memory. A smile never shown, a portrait never quite honest, a set of teeth. Made of wood? Among the many details that form the mythos of George Washington, the first president, the revolutionary general, the stoic founding father, one image has remained oddly persistent and strangely humanizing: the idea that he had wooden teeth. It's a story repeated in classrooms and trivia books, in cartoons and historic tours. Washington, solemn and resolute, hiding a set of crudely carved wooden dentures behind a tight-lipped expression. A man too dignified to complain, enduring the discomfort of splinters and warped smiles for the sake of appearance. But is it true? Not quite. George Washington did suffer from terrible dental problems. By the time of his inauguration in 1789, he had only one natural tooth remaining. Throughout much of his adult life, he experienced frequent pain, inflammation, and tooth loss. His letters mention it often. He purchased dental tools, he paid for tooth cleanings, and he even sought out transplants, offering money to enslaved people in exchange for their teeth, a disturbing detail that further complicates the history of his famously flawed smile. But his dentures were never made of wood. The truth is both more advanced and more unsettling. Washington's dentures were a complex, handcrafted mixture of materials: human teeth, animal teeth, often from horses or cows, along with ivory, gold, and lead. The base was often carved from hippopotamus ivory, shaped and fitted with springs and metal wires to hold them in place. These devices were painful, awkward, and far from seamless. They distorted his jaw, gave him a puffy appearance in portraits, and often made it difficult for him to speak clearly. But wood? Never. So, where did the myth come from? There are several theories. Some historians suggest that over time, ivory dentures, especially after years of use, would become stained and cracked. Discolored ivory could take on a dark, grainy appearance, especially if poorly maintained. In the imagination of later generations, that visual texture may have resembled wood. It's possible that early accounts describe the dentures as looking wooden, and the description slowly hardened into fact. Others point to the power of storytelling. The idea of Washington, the great patriot, soldiering on with wooden teeth, adds a layer of humility to his legend. It brings him down from his marble pedestal and into the realm of ordinary struggle. It makes him relatable, an icon not only of leadership, but of quiet perseverance. A man who led a revolution and endured the presidency while dealing with a mouth full of splinters. There's something compelling in that image, even if it isn't real. In many ways, the wooden teeth myth reflects the larger process by which historical figures are softened, reshaped, and refitted for the purposes of culture. Just as Abraham Lincoln is remembered chiefly for a single speech and a tall hat, and just as Napoleon is recalled more for his alleged shortness than his strategic brilliance, Washington's dentures became a shorthand, a single tangible flaw that stood in for a lifetime of quieter, messier truths. The real George Washington was a man of contradictions, an advocate of liberty who enslaved others, a champion of honor who kept secrets, a reluctant leader who helped build a powerful presidency. His struggles with dental disease were only one small part of his private suffering. But the wooden teeth myth endures because it's digestible, easy, memorable. And yet, when we peer more closely into his letters, his doctor's notes, the surviving sets of dentures preserved in museums, we find something richer than a quirky anecdote. We find evidence of a man navigating chronic pain while maintaining the outward appearance of command. A man whose physical discomfort may have influenced his famously aloof demeanor. A man who avoided speaking at length in public, not out of shyness, but because his jaw hurt, because his dentures didn't fit properly, because his teeth, made not of wood but of bone and metal and compromise, were always on his mind. The more we learn, the more we recognize how this small myth, charming as it might seem, hides a deeper, more human story. And perhaps that's the real value of re-examining our historical beliefs. Not to strip away wonder, but to replace it with understanding. To see figures like Washington not as flawless symbols, but as people. Complex, conflicted, imperfect. It's easy to cling to the myths. They're familiar. They smooth the rough edges of history. But the real stories, the ones just beneath the surface, often reveal far more. So we ask, how many other myths began with a detail misread, a metaphor misunderstood, a shadow mistaken for truth? In a time when truth and legend often blur, perhaps it's not about choosing one over the other, but about learning to see the space in between, where facts don't erase wonder, and wonder doesn't eclipse reality, where even a pair of false teeth can remind us that history is always waiting to be looked at again, more closely, more carefully, with the grain turned toward the light. From the hidden truths behind a founding father's quiet discomfort, we step even further back, into the mists of time, where myth and memory blur, to a place of heroes and gods, of wooden horses and burning cities, a war sung by poets for millennia, a war many once believed never truly happened. But as we peer into the layers of time, we find that the line between legend and history is not always so easily drawn. For centuries, the Trojan War was considered nothing more than a story, a grand tale, yes, an epic spun by Homer in the Iliad, but a tale nonetheless. Achilles, Hector, Helen of Troy. The face that launched 1,000 ships. A wooden horse filled with warriors. For generations, these names and images lived in the realm of myth alongside gods and monsters, nymphs and oracles. Scholars in the Enlightenment and the early modern period often dismissed the war as allegory, a poetic invention meant to teach moral lessons or glorify ancient heroes. Troy, they believed, was a literary stage, not a real city. The war? A metaphor, a fable, a fiction wrapped in bronze and blood. But was it really only that? In the late 19th century, a man named Heinrich Schliemann arrived in modern-day Turkey with a shovel, a copy of Homer, and a controversial belief that the stories of the Iliad held a seed of truth. That the city of Troy was not just a figment of poetic imagination, but a place that once stood in stone. His excavation at a mound known as Hisarlik revealed layer upon layer of ancient settlement, cities built atop older cities, stretching back thousands of years. Among them was a fortified city dating to the late Bronze Age, around 1200 BC. It had been destroyed by fire and war. Its location matched the general descriptions of Homer's Troy. Its walls were high. Its ruins told of conflict. Could it be? Schliemann believed it was Troy. Many others began to wonder the same. Over time, with more careful and scientifically rigorous excavations, archaeologists confirmed that Hisarlik had indeed been the site of a powerful Bronze Age city, a city with trade connections, strategic importance, and a history of violent destruction. Still, questions remained. Was this the Troy? Was there really a war over Helen, over pride, over gods whispering from Olympus? Did a wooden horse trick the Trojans into opening their gates? Almost certainly not in the way Homer tells it. The epics are filled with exaggeration, divine intervention, and narrative drama. But beneath the flourishes, historians and archaeologists now believe there was a war, or perhaps several wars, between Mycenaean Greeks and the cities of Anatolia, including one that may have been called Wilusa, a name strikingly close to Ilios, the alternate name for Troy. Ancient Hittite texts discovered in archives far from Greece mention a city-state that scholars link to Troy. These records describe diplomatic disputes, military tension, and power struggles in the region, events that echo, faintly, the background of Homer's tale. And so what once was thought to be myth has begun to reveal a trace of reality. Not a single war sparked by a stolen queen, but perhaps a series of regional conflicts. Not a wooden horse, but a clever siege. Not Achilles and Hector as they are sung, but real warriors whose names are now lost to time. Why then did we ever believe it was all a fable? Perhaps because the poetry outshone the past. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey are not history books. They are art, oral tradition shaped into rhythm, character, and grandeur. They were not meant to preserve facts, but to preserve meaning. The cost of rage, the pain of loss, the glory of sacrifice. Over time, as the gods and monsters crowded the pages, the real war faded beneath the legends that grew in its place. And yet, like so many myths, the story endured, because it told us something we wanted to believe. That honor could endure even in the face of ruin. That courage could echo through time. That even the greatest cities could fall, not just from swords, but from the pride of kings and the anger of men. What we now know is that history and myth often begin at the same source: memory. A war, long ago, sung by travelers, retold in halls and by firelight, remembered and reshaped with each new voice. Over centuries, details shift. Heroes become larger than life. Events take on a rhythm more suited to poetry than to fact. And somewhere along the way, history becomes myth, until someone, centuries later, wonders if there is still something solid beneath the story. And often there is. The walls of Troy did stand. They were battered. They were burned. And though we may never know exactly who fought there, or why, we know now that something did happen. Something real. Something remembered. So, as we step away from the battlefield of ancient Anatolia, with its wind-scoured ruins and stories half buried in the dust, we are left with a thought, that the past does not always come to us as it was, but as it was told. And in those tellings, we sometimes forget to ask what might have truly remained beneath the ashes. What other myths, we might ask, still hide a grain of truth, waiting quietly beneath the soil? From the smoldering ruins of Troy and the blurred edges of myth, we turn now to a more recent chapter in human memory, one still echoing through classrooms, courthouses, and streets. It's a story often told with clarity and certainty, a single document, a signature, a sudden wave of freedom. But just as ancient legends conceal more than they reveal, so too does this well-known page in American history. We are taught, often early, that President Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves with the stroke of a pen. The Emancipation Proclamation, solemn, sweeping, and powerful, is remembered as a moral turning point in the American Civil War. January 1st, 1863. The day slavery ended. The moment when freedom was declared for all who had lived in bondage across the United States. But the truth, as always, is more complex. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free all enslaved people. In fact, it did not free a single person living in a Union state. It did not free those in the border states that had remained loyal to the Union, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and Missouri. Nor did it free the enslaved people living in parts of the Confederacy already under Union control, such as parts of Tennessee and Louisiana. It applied only to those enslaved in the rebellious territories where the U.S. government, at the time, had no actual power to enforce it. So what did it do? It declared that all persons held as slaves in rebellious states shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. In other words, it was a promise, an intention, more than an act of liberation. A moral and political statement cast into a war-torn map, a weapon of diplomacy and ideology as much as of justice. Why then has it been remembered as a moment of sudden and total freedom? Perhaps because that's what people needed to believe. In times of upheaval, clarity is comforting. The image of Lincoln, tall and grave, setting the captives free is easier to hold than the jagged reality of policy, strategy, and incomplete emancipation. But understanding what the Emancipation Proclamation was and what it was not helps us grasp the deeper layers of the Civil War and its aftermath. By 1863, the war had shifted. What began as a fight to preserve the Union had become a battle over the soul of the nation. Lincoln, ever pragmatic, understood that emancipation would weaken the Confederacy, deter European support for the South, and give the war a higher purpose. The proclamation allowed African Americans to join the Union Army. Nearly 200,000 would serve by the war's end. It reframed the war not just as a conflict of states, but as a crusade for human freedom. And in that sense, it mattered deeply. But legal freedom, real, enforceable, national emancipation, would not come until later. It would take the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in December 1865, to fully and permanently abolish slavery throughout the United States. Only then did the law match the promise. Even then, freedom was uneven. Formerly enslaved people were declared free, but often left without protection, land, or opportunity. The period of Reconstruction brought both hope and betrayal. The promise of equality enshrined in new laws was met with resistance, violence, and the birth of new systems of oppression: black codes, convict leasing, sharecropping, Jim Crow. In many ways, the chains were reshaped rather than removed. And yet, the image of the Emancipation Proclamation endures. It hangs in museums, etched in solemn black ink. It's quoted in speeches, celebrated in textbooks, memorialized in art. Its symbolism, powerful, righteous, and inspiring, has outshone its limited legal scope. Why? Because we long for turning points, for lines in the sand, for moments that tell us the world changed overnight. But history rarely works that way. Freedom, in the United States and elsewhere, has been a long, uneven road, less like a proclamation and more like a slow, painful unfolding. Every step forward met with resistance. Every new law tested not just by its words, but by the will of those meant to uphold it. The proclamation, for all its limits, did mark a shift. It told the world that the Union now stood against slavery. It laid the moral groundwork for what would follow. And for the enslaved people who heard its words, smuggled in through sermons, whispered across plantations, passed from soldier to civilian, it brought hope. Not immediate change, but a signal that change had begun. And sometimes, that signal is enough to stir the ground beneath a nation. So why do we remember it as total and immediate freedom? Maybe because, in its flawed reach and soaring language, it captured the heart of a nation struggling with its conscience. Maybe because it represents the difference between law and justice, between words and action, and our ongoing journey to close that gap. And maybe, just maybe, because history is made not only by what is, but by what people believe it could be. As we turn the page on this chapter, we are reminded once more that the truth of the past is often more difficult, more tangled, and more revealing than the myths we inherit. And in that difficulty, we find something far more enduring than legend, the real story of how freedom is made, not in a single moment, but in many, over years, through struggle. And we're left with a quiet question. What other moments in history have we smoothed into symbols, before fully understanding the shadows they leave behind? As we step away from the inked promises of emancipation and the long, winding road toward true freedom, we now turn back further, toward an era cloaked in fire and fear. An era often remembered through whispered warnings, shadowy robes, and cries in the night. It has become a byword for cruelty, intolerance, and mass persecution. But how much of what we believe about the Spanish Inquisition is history, and how much is inherited fear? To mention the Spanish Inquisition is to summon a familiar image, a vast and ruthless machine of religious terror. Torture chambers hidden beneath churches, hooded inquisitors wringing confessions from trembling heretics, and above all, an unimaginable death toll. Millions, it's often said, burned at the stake in the name of orthodoxy and order. It's an image that has persisted for centuries, a phrase that evokes instant dread. No one expects the Spanish Inquisition. Even satire has found a place in its shadow. But how accurate is it? Did the Spanish Inquisition truly kill millions? The answer, surprisingly, is no. While the Inquisition was real, and often harsh in its methods and mission, the scale of death traditionally associated with it has been greatly exaggerated over time, magnified by centuries of propaganda, misunderstanding, and myth-making. The Spanish Inquisition was established in 1478 under the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile. Its original purpose was to ensure the sincerity of conversions, particularly among Jewish and Muslim populations who had, under pressure or decree, accepted Christianity. These conversos were suspected of secretly continuing their old faiths. The Inquisition's task was to investigate and, if necessary, punish religious deviation. It's important to understand the world in which it emerged. Spain, at the end of the 15th century, was a patchwork of kingdoms recently unified. Religious identity was tied closely to national identity, and the fear of internal threat, especially after centuries of Muslim rule, was palpable. The Inquisition, in many ways, was born from a desire to control not just territory, but belief. And yet, contrary to the popular image of indiscriminate violence, the Inquisition operated under a defined, if deeply flawed, legal structure. Accused individuals were often held in prison, interrogated, and given chances to confess and recant. Torture was used, yes, but not nearly to the extent often portrayed, and not always to extract confessions. More often, it was applied to test the sincerity of already admitted guilt. Inhumane by modern standards, certainly, but not the unhinged brutality that popular fiction so often suggests. As for executions, the actual number is far smaller than the myth suggests. Modern historians estimate that over the course of the Spanish Inquisition, from its founding in 1478 to its formal abolition in 1834, approximately 3,000 to 5,000 people were executed. A terrible number, to be sure, but nowhere near the millions often cited. These executions took place over more than 3 centuries, and not all involved burning or public spectacle. So where did the myth come from? Part of the answer lies in the politics of the time. Spain, as it grew in power during the 16th and 17th centuries, became a rival to many European nations, particularly Protestant ones. In England and the Netherlands, anti-Catholic sentiment ran deep. Propaganda against Spain portrayed the Inquisition as the very embodiment of religious tyranny. Pamphlets, engravings, and lurid tales circulated widely. The Black Legend of Spain was born, a narrative that painted the country as uniquely cruel, backward, and oppressive. The Inquisition, with its secrecy and symbols, became an ideal villain. Its existence was real, but its horrors were inflated, sometimes deliberately, to serve political ends. Later, during the Enlightenment, philosophers and writers looking to critique the Church and champion reason found in the Inquisition a convenient symbol of intolerance. And in modern times, fiction, film, and popular culture have continued to amplify its legend, a grim backdrop for thrillers, a cautionary tale in school books, a punchline in satire. And yet, there is a quiet danger in exaggeration. When we inflate the past into monstrous proportions, we risk losing sight of its true lessons. The Spanish Inquisition was a dark chapter, marked by religious rigidity, systemic injustice, and the suppression of conscience. But it was not an unstoppable force of mass murder. It was, like so many institutions, shaped by its time, by fear, by politics, and by power. To see it clearly is not to excuse it, but to understand it. And in understanding, we can better guard against the forces that allowed it to rise. It also reminds us that memory is not just about facts. It's about framing, about who tells the story, and why. The myth of the million deaths tells us less about what actually happened and more about how cultures define enemies, construct identity, and shape morality through narrative. So we ask ourselves, once more, why do we remember it this way? Perhaps because scale gives shape to fear. To say that millions died elevates the Inquisition from an historical event to an existential threat. It becomes not just a period, but a symbol of everything we fear about unchecked authority, about religion turned into control, about justice turned into ritual. And perhaps, in that symbol, we find something more timeless, a warning not just about the past, but about ourselves. As we move forward in this exploration of historical lies, the Spanish Inquisition stands as a reminder that even the darkest corners of history deserve the clarity of careful light, that the truth, however sobering or nuanced, is always more instructive than the myth. And so we leave the echo of those chambers behind, not with denial, not with sensationalism, but with the quiet understanding that even legends built on truth can stray far from it. How many more stories, we might wonder, have grown larger in shadow than they ever were in life? From the shadowed halls of the Inquisition, where fear and exaggeration intertwined, we move now to another curious tale from the medieval world. A story wrapped in metal, modesty, and mystery. It has long lived on the fringes of popular imagination, part grotesque, part symbolic. But as we step quietly into the pages of this particular myth, we find ourselves asking, was it ever real at all? For centuries, the image has lingered. A cold, iron contraption, crude, locked, and painful, worn by women during the Middle Ages to guard their chastity while their husbands rode off to war. The chastity belt, a device said to ensure fidelity, to prevent temptation, to enforce control. A relic, we're told, of a darker, more barbaric time when honor was protected with padlocks and steel. The story is familiar. It has appeared in museums, books, and even cartoons, sometimes as an object of horror, sometimes of mockery. It feeds into the larger narrative of the Dark Ages, a time, we imagine, when superstition and cruelty ruled, and when bodily autonomy was quite literally stripped away. But was this ever true? Did medieval women really wear chastity belts? Surprisingly, there is little, if any, credible evidence to support the idea that chastity belts were ever widely used in the Middle Ages. Most of what we know, or think we know about them, appears to have emerged long after the era they are most often associated with. The earliest visual references to a chastity belt come not from the medieval period, but from the Renaissance, specifically from satirical or allegorical artworks. A 16th century German engraving, for instance, shows a chastity belt as a comedic prop rather than a real wearable device. Similarly, literary references from the time often use the idea of a belt symbolically to represent jealousy or control, not as a literal practice. And the actual objects, the iron belts displayed in cabinets of curiosity or dusty museum corners, most were created in the 18th and 19th centuries. Some were intended as medical restraints to prevent masturbation, reflecting the anxieties of the Victorian age rather than the Middle Ages. Others were outright fabrications, designed to titillate, shock, or satisfy the growing public appetite for medieval oddities. So how did the myth begin? In part, it was fueled by a fascination with the past, a romanticized and grotesque view of medieval Europe that flourished during the 19th century. As scholars, collectors, and amateur historians began digging into Europe's medieval heritage, they often misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented what they found. Objects were misdated. Fiction was treated as fact. The chastity belt became one more piece in a growing puzzle of imagined medieval backwardness. At the same time, the concept served as a perfect metaphor. It encapsulated all the things people feared or scorned about the past: patriarchal domination, sexual repression, technological primitiveness. In the chastity belt, modern thinkers found an easy symbol of how far they had come, or believed they had come, from the ignorance and brutality of earlier times. And so the myth endured. It found its way into textbooks, into pop culture, into museum displays. Few questioned its origins. Fewer still asked whether the idea made sense. After all, the belts as described would have been not only physically excruciating but medically dangerous. Hygiene would have been nearly impossible. Infection, injury, and suffering would have been guaranteed. And there are no known medieval medical texts, court records, or personal letters that mention such devices being used in practice. But myths, as we've seen, often persist not because they are true, but because they feel true. They align with what we think we know. They confirm our expectations. They offer a vivid picture in place of a complex reality. In reality, medieval Europe was a world governed by complicated social codes and religious expectations. Fidelity, especially for women, was indeed valued, often harshly enforced through social pressure, family alliances, and church doctrine. But control was exerted through surveillance, confinement, and shame, not iron mechanisms. And yet, the chastity belt remains in our cultural consciousness. Why? Perhaps because it is such a potent symbol of control, of mistrust, of the attempt to regulate not just behavior, but desire. In a single object, it crystallizes centuries of anxiety about sex, gender, and power. And perhaps because it is easier to imagine a literal device than to confront the more subtle, enduring ways that societies shape and restrict individual freedom. As we step back from this peculiar artifact, real or imagined, we are left with more than just questions about metal and myth. We are invited to reconsider how we remember the past. What do we accept without inquiry? What images pass from one generation to the next, unchallenged, unexamined? History, after all, is not just a record of what happened. It is also a reflection of what we believe happened, and why. The chastity belt may never have clanked its way through medieval halls, but it has moved, quite effectively, through the corridors of imagination. And in doing so, it tells us not about the Middle Ages, but about ourselves, about what we choose to remember and what we fail to question. What other relics, we might wonder, were never worn, yet remain locked in the stories we tell? From the imagined clink of medieval chastity belts to the whispered fears of forbidden power, we find ourselves now stepping into darker soil, into a village marked not by iron, but by hysteria. Salem, a name that still echoes with fire and accusation. And yet, even here, where myth and memory blur, not all is as we were taught to believe. It is one of the most chilling and familiar images in American history. The Salem witch trials, hysterical crowds, screaming girls, courtrooms filled with trembling accusers and grim judges, and outside, stakes, flames, the condemned tied to posts, crying out as fire consumes them. Witches burned for their sins against God and community. But here is the quiet truth. No one was burned at the stake in Salem, not a single person. The myth of witches burning in colonial Massachusetts is one of the most persistent misconceptions in popular history. It evokes images from Europe, scenes of medieval punishment, torchlit crowds, and the terrible weight of fire as justice. But in Salem and in the rest of Puritan New England, that particular fate did not come. The real story is no less haunting, but it is more grounded, more intimate, and perhaps even more disturbing in its quiet cruelty. Between February 1692 and May 1693, a wave of fear swept through Salem and neighboring towns. It began with strange fits, young girls convulsing, screaming, naming names. Accusations spread like wildfire. The supposed crime? Witchcraft, making pacts with the devil, causing illness, conjuring spirits. The community spiraled. By the time the hysteria settled, more than 200 people had been accused. 19 were executed by hanging. One man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death under heavy stones for refusing to enter a plea. Several others died in prison, but not one was burned. Hanging was the legal method of execution for witchcraft in colonial America, reflecting English law rather than continental European practices. Burning, while horrifyingly common in parts of Europe during earlier centuries, was not the method employed in Salem. It was never even proposed. So why do we picture flames? Partly because the broader image of witch persecution is shaped by European history. Across the continent, in countries like Germany, Switzerland, and France, thousands of people were burned during witch hunts that peaked between the 15th and 17th centuries. In those places, fire was often seen as a purifying force, a spiritual cleansing, a visible warning. These scenes, recorded in drawings and texts, became embedded in the Western imagination. Over time, they merged with the American story, and the boundaries between history and symbolism began to dissolve. But there is another reason. Fire is more cinematic, more permanent. It dramatizes the horror. To say someone was hanged may evoke legal execution. To say they were burned evokes spectacle, torment, and total annihilation. In movies, books, and Halloween tales, it is the fire we remember because it feels final, unforgivable, and inhuman. And yet, perhaps the real tragedy lies not in the fire, but in the fragile human machinery that allowed neighbors to turn on each other. In the soft-spoken testimony of a child accusing a widow. In the panicked whispers of Puritan ministers. In the silence of a courtroom where innocence meant nothing once suspicion had taken root. The Salem witch trials were not marked by flames, but by fear, by the invisible weight of belief, by the terrifying ease with which a community can become convinced that evil walks among them, dressed as ordinary people. The myth persisted, though. It folded itself into folklore and popular retellings. And each time the story was told again, the fire grew brighter in our minds. It's worth asking, what does the myth do for us? Perhaps it allows us to distance ourselves, to see the people of Salem as more brutal, more primitive than they really were. Fire becomes a symbol of an age gone wrong, a way to say, that would never happen now. But history, as always, asks harder questions. Because the real danger of Salem wasn't in the method of execution, it was in the mindset, in the deep certainty of righteousness, in the willingness to believe without proof, in the systems that punished the accused more quickly than the accusers. Those patterns, quiet, slow-burning, deeply human, are not so easily left in the past. Even now, the word witch hunt carries political and cultural weight. It is used and misused to describe injustice, real or perceived. But how often do we remember what it truly meant? Not metaphorically, but in the cold stone of the Salem jail, in the inked signatures on arrest warrants, in the rope that waited behind the courthouse. And how often do we pause to ask what else we've misunderstood? As we gently lay to rest the image of witches burning in Salem, we do not diminish the tragedy. We clarify it. We see it more clearly. We honor the lives lost, not as flames, but as stories. People caught in the currents of fear and faith. People remembered, not for what they were accused of, but for what we can still learn from their fate. What other moments, we might wonder, have we set ablaze in our imagination, only to find the truth smoldering quietly in the shadows? From the haunted town of Salem, where fear eclipsed fact and memory blurred into myth, we now journey further back, into a time often painted with darkness, a world of stone walls and candlelight, of monks copying texts and whispers of heresy. And among the many stories told about this era, one claim rises again and again, that medieval people believed the earth was flat. But what if that shadow over the Middle Ages is one we cast ourselves? It's a tale often told with a sigh or a smirk, that during the so-called Dark Ages, the people of Europe, peasants and kings, priests and scholars alike, believed they lived on a flat earth, that anyone who spoke of a sphere, a world turning in space, would be laughed out of the room or branded a heretic. That it took brave navigators like Christopher Columbus to challenge the ignorance of their time and prove that Earth is, in fact, round. It's a story that feels neat, comforting even, a reminder of how far we've come. But it's not true. The idea that most medieval Europeans believed in a flat Earth is a modern myth, one that says more about the way we view the past than about the past itself. In truth, the spherical shape of the Earth was well known to educated people in the Middle Ages. Not only was it understood, it was taught. By the 7th century, European scholars were referencing classical works from Greek antiquity that clearly described a round planet. The writings of Aristotle, Ptolemy, and others had survived, copied by monks and studied in cathedral schools. These thinkers had explained the curved shadow of the Earth on the moon during a lunar eclipse. They had reasoned, long before telescopes, that only a sphere could cast such a shadow. Even earlier, in the 6th century, the Roman philosopher Boethius wrote plainly, "The Earth is like a sphere." In the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas, perhaps the most influential Christian theologian of the age, casually discussed Earth's roundness as if it were obvious. No controversy, no denial, just fact. So where did the myth of medieval flat Earth belief come from? To answer that, we have to look not at the Middle Ages, but at the 19th century. During this time, a wave of writers, historians, and polemicists, many of them champions of science and reason, sought to cast the medieval world as ignorant and superstitious. Their goal was not always to understand the past, but to distance themselves from it. In painting the Middle Ages as a time of darkness and backward thinking, they highlighted their own era as a triumph of enlightenment. Among them was the American writer Washington Irving. In his fictionalized biography, A History of the Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus, 1828, Irving dramatized the moment Columbus approached the Spanish court with his bold plan to sail west to reach Asia. In Irving's version, the scholars and priests scoffed, not because they feared the unknown distances or doubted Columbus's calculations, but because they thought the earth was flat and that he would fall off the edge. It made for good reading, but it wasn't history. That image of Columbus bravely standing against the ignorance of a flat earth church was powerful. It entered school books. It became part of national mythology. It echoed the 19th century confidence in progress, science, and reason. And over time, it replaced the more nuanced truth. But the real debates Columbus faced had little to do with the shape of the earth. Educated people in 15th century Spain agreed it was round. What they disagreed with was Columbus's estimate of its size, and whether a voyage west would actually lead to Asia or into a vast, empty sea. In this, the scholars were closer to the truth than Columbus himself, who dramatically underestimated the Earth's circumference. So, why does the myth endure? Perhaps because it tells us what we want to hear. That ignorance was once universal, but that knowledge triumphed. That the past was dim, and the present enlightened. The flat Earth myth becomes a convenient symbol of science suppressed by religion, of progress triumphing over fear. But it simplifies too much. It reduces centuries of intellectual history into a cartoonish before and after. In reality, the Middle Ages were not a monolith of ignorance. They were complex, dynamic, and often deeply curious. While access to learning was limited, especially for the poor, the educated classes did not live in intellectual darkness. They read ancient texts, studied the stars, debated theology and natural philosophy. They laid the groundwork for the Renaissance, not in spite of their era, but as part of it. And so, we begin to see how myths shape not just our view of history, but of ourselves. The idea that people once believed the earth was flat is not just a misunderstanding. It's a kind of mirror, a way for modernity to reassure itself of its own wisdom, to say, we know better now. But true wisdom lies not in looking back with condescension, but with understanding, with curiosity, with the willingness to ask what people truly knew and how they knew it. So we return to the medieval classroom, to the monk copying a Latin manuscript by candlelight, to the scholar turning the pages of Aristotle, noting the curvature of Earth's shadow in the margin. These were not people waiting to be rescued by modern science. They were part of the same long conversation about the world, the cosmos, and our place within it. And we are left, once again, with a quiet thought. What else have we misunderstood? Not because the past was wrong, but because we forgot how carefully it once searched for truth. As we leave behind the imagined flat horizons of the medieval mind, we stay in that same world, dusty and dim as it's so often portrayed, but shift our focus from the heavens to the earth, from celestial geometry to something more tangible, cleanliness. For even here in the realm of soap and water, a story has taken hold, one of filth, stench, and indifference. But was the Middle Ages truly a time when no one bathed? It's an image so deeply ingrained in our cultural memory that it rarely needs questioning. The Middle Ages, we're told, were dirty, not metaphorically, but literally. Streets teeming with waste, peasants coated in grime, kings with unwashed hands and queens who bathed perhaps once a year, if that. It's become a kind of shorthand, a single brushstroke used to paint an entire era as uncivilized, ignorant, and uncaring about personal hygiene. But as with so many stories we've inherited about the past, the truth is both more nuanced and more revealing. Did medieval people really never bathe? The short answer is no. They did bathe, and often more than we've been led to believe. Let us begin not with the stereotype, but with the water itself. In towns and cities across medieval Europe, public bathhouses were a common feature. Inspired by the Roman model, these establishments continued to function in various forms well into the Middle Ages. In 13th century Paris, for example, there were dozens of public baths in operation, frequented by people of different classes. In the German-speaking world, cities like Nuremberg and Cologne had bathhouses that were social hubs, as well as places for washing. Patrons would gather to cleanse, to relax, and to socialize, sometimes even to dine, as food and drink were served between steamy walls. Manuscripts and artwork from the time depict these scenes: wooden tubs, heated stones, smiling faces, people washing their hair, rubbing each other's backs. Far from avoiding water, medieval people, especially in urban centers, valued bathing as both a hygienic and communal activity. Even in the countryside, where access to such facilities was limited, washing was not unknown. Rivers, wells, and heated basins provided means for personal cleanliness. Linen undergarments, worn next to the skin, were regularly washed and changed. Hair was combed with care. Herbs were used to scent water, and certain soaps, made from animal fat and ashes or imported from the Islamic world, were available and used. So where did the myth of the dirty Middle Ages come from? Several roots twist together here. One important shift occurred during the later Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, when changing medical theories, particularly those influenced by Galenic thought, began to view frequent bathing with suspicion. According to some beliefs, hot water could open the pores, making the body more vulnerable to disease. As plague swept across Europe in waves, people understandably grew cautious. Some bathhouses, especially those in larger cities, closed their doors, first for fear of contagion and later for moral reasons, as public bathing became more closely associated with prostitution and vice. Then came the Protestant Reformation. With its emphasis on modesty, discipline, and moral purity, Protestant writers often condemned the sensual indulgence of bathhouses. Cleanliness of the soul came to matter more than the body. The bath, once seen as a place of renewal, was reimagined as a site of temptation. And later still, during the 18th and 19th centuries, historians, novelists, and educators, especially in the English-speaking world, looked back on the Middle Ages through the lens of enlightenment. They wanted to show how far society had progressed from the so-called Dark Ages. One of the easiest ways to do that was to contrast modern hygiene with imagined medieval filth. But the Middle Ages were not a 1,000-year pause in cleanliness. In monasteries, monks followed rules that included regular washing of hands, feet, and even full-body baths on designated days. Hospitals maintained by religious orders made space for hygiene as part of care. Wealthy households had their own bathing chambers. Even traveling pilgrims and laborers carried small cloths and combs. Cleanliness may not have meant sterilization, but it did mean something. Still, the myth persists. Why? Perhaps because it serves a purpose. It allows us to distance ourselves from the past, to feel superior. It makes history easier to dramatize and to judge. A muddy peasant makes for a better character in film. A filthy king adds shock value to the textbook. Clean people in the past, after all, feel too much like us. And myths are often more comforting than ambiguity. But in dispelling this particular myth, something more than accuracy is gained. We begin to see the Middle Ages not as a time of ignorance, but of adaptation. People made choices based on what they knew. They used the resources available to them. They valued comfort and community. They were shaped, just as we are, by circumstance, by fear, by fashion, by faith. And perhaps that is the most human truth of all. So we leave behind the dim halls and steaming bathhouses of a world both distant and familiar, not to glorify it or to rewrite it with rose-colored water, but to see it as it was, a world of effort, care, and ritual, a world where people like us looked for ways to feel clean, whole, and at peace with their bodies. And we are left, once again, with a quiet thought. How many other assumptions do we carry about the past, not because they were ever true, but because they were easy to believe? From the warm water of medieval bathhouses, where cleanliness met ritual and myth faded into fact, we move now to a darker night, one lit not by lanterns or hearth fires, but by flames rising from the heart of a city. Rome, burning. And at the center of it all, we've been told, stood an emperor, indifferent and detached, playing music as his empire fell to ashes. But as we listen more carefully to this ancient melody, the tune may not be what we've so long believed. While Rome burned, Nero fiddled. It's a phrase many of us know by heart, an idiom of apathy, a shorthand for failed leadership, even a cultural cliché. We imagine the scene vividly, the flames leaping through wooden roofs, the cries of the citizens echoing through narrow streets, and above it all, Emperor Nero, seated, serene, plucking at his fiddle, lost in the sound of his own art while his people suffered. But there is one small problem with this image. The fiddle, as we know it today, did not exist in ancient Rome. The violin wouldn't be invented for another 1,500 years. And yet the story persists. Powerful, dramatic, memorable. If not a literal fiddle, perhaps it was a lyre or cithara, instruments Nero was known to play. Still, even that picture of Nero strumming strings while flames devoured his capital is far more legend than record. So, what really happened? The Great Fire of Rome began on the night of July 18, 64 AD. It spread quickly through the tightly packed neighborhoods of the city, fueled by dry conditions and wooden buildings clustered close together. For 6 days, the fire raged. When it was finally extinguished, 10 of Rome's 14 districts had suffered damage. 3 were completely destroyed. It was a catastrophe of staggering scale. The ancient historian Tacitus, writing decades later, tells us that Nero was not in Rome when the fire broke out. He was at his villa in Antium, roughly 30 miles away. Upon hearing the news, he returned and, according to some accounts, opened his private gardens to house the homeless. He organized relief efforts, arranged for food supplies, and even paid for rebuilding efforts out of his own treasury. But Tacitus also leaves room for ambiguity. He writes that rumors began to swirl, that Nero had not only failed to stop the fire, but had perhaps started it himself, that he had wanted to clear space for his grand architectural ambitions, that, amid the flames, he stood on a tower and sang of the fall of Troy, likening himself to a tragic hero in a story too large for mortal hands. Was it true? Or was it the beginning of something else, something more dangerous than fire? For Nero was a man who inspired extremes. He was theatrical, eccentric, and deeply disliked by the Senate and many aristocrats. His reign was marked by paranoia, executions, and extravagance. He fancied himself an artist, an actor, a poet, a performer, much to the dismay of Rome's traditional elite. In life, he was controversial. In death, he was easy to vilify. The story of Nero playing music as the city burned was not widely circulated until after his fall. Later historians, such as Suetonius and Cassius Dio, wrote damning accounts of his behavior, sometimes mixing fact with theatrical invention. They described his lavish lifestyle, his artistic pretensions, and his cruelty in lurid detail. To them, Nero was not merely a bad emperor. He was the worst kind of emperor, one who loved spectacle more than state. And what greater symbol of neglect and narcissism could there be than music played amid the ruin of an empire? The myth fit perfectly. It satisfied a deeper need, the need to assign blame, to explain tragedy, to moralize history. It made the fire not just a disaster, but a lesson. And so it spread, retold for centuries, each time becoming more vivid, more damning, more memorable. It didn't matter that the details were wrong. It didn't matter that Nero had, at least initially, helped with recovery, or that his actual misdeeds, his executions, his political purges, his later descent into tyranny, were far more complex. The image of the fiddling emperor was too powerful to resist. And so, it has endured. In paintings, in plays, in modern political commentary. A leader who fails in the face of crisis is said to fiddle while Rome burns. It is a phrase that conjures both incompetence and indifference. A symbol not just of Nero, but of every leader who seems to look away at the wrong moment. But what do we lose in turning people into symbols? Perhaps we lose the complexity of history, the murky details, the uncomfortable truths that don't fit neatly into storybooks. Nero was flawed, deeply so, but he was not simply the villain we've made him out to be in this single moment. He was a man in a crumbling empire, surrounded by enemies, shaped by ambition and fear. And perhaps the fire was not just a test of character, but a reflection of the fragility of power itself. So we leave behind the charred streets of ancient Rome and the distant echo of strings that may never have been played, not to clear Nero's name, but to see more clearly. To understand how myth, once woven into history, can obscure more than it reveals. And once again, we're left with a quiet question. How many stories from the past have we remembered? Not because they were true, but because they were unforgettable. As the imagined strains of Nero's fiddle fade into the smoke of burning Rome, we remain within the echoing arches of the empire, where spectacle and survival often shared the same stage. In our minds, one image rises clearly from the dust of the amphitheater. The gladiator, sword drawn, bloodied and bowed, waiting for the crowd's final verdict. But here, too, behind the roar of the Colosseum, history tells a quieter, more complicated truth. We are taught and often shown that the Roman gladiatorial arena was a place of pure brutality. Two men enter, one man leaves. It's a scene that feels almost cinematic. Armor clashing under a hot Mediterranean sun, a final blow struck to the chest, and a helpless plea for mercy as a crowd of thousands decides whether a man lives or dies, thumbs up or thumbs down. We picture endless slaughter, fighters condemned from the start, and we assume that to step into the arena was to march toward certain death. But was it really? Did all gladiators die in the arena? In truth, most did not. The image of constant bloodshed, of every contest ending in death, is a myth, one crafted not just by later storytellers and filmmakers, but in part by Rome itself. For the gladiatorial games were always about more than violence. They were about control, spectacle, honor, and calculated risk. And the men who fought in the sands of the Colosseum were not always victims. They were professionals. Many gladiators were slaves, yes, captives from war, criminals, or those born into servitude. But others were volunteers, men who willingly entered the gladiator schools, often for the promise of fame, prize money, or even a better life. Once trained, they became skilled athletes with specific styles, each type of fighter known by distinctive armor and tactics. The retiarius, with his net and trident. The secutor, with his smooth helmet and short sword. The myrmillo, the thraex, the hoplomachus. Each had a role to play, and fans who followed them. To train a gladiator was expensive. To feed him, house him, and teach him was an investment. A single match could take months of preparation. And so, contrary to the myth, organizers rarely allowed both fighters to die. A death was dramatic, yes, but unnecessary and economically wasteful. Most bouts ended with one man yielding, not with one man dying, and when a gladiator fell, he could plead for mercy. This is where the thumb enters the scene. We often imagine the Roman crowd deciding life or death with a raised or lowered thumb, but ancient sources are unclear about exactly what gesture meant what. The phrase police verso, with a turned thumb, appears in some texts, but it doesn't specify the direction. Did up mean death? Did down? Did a closed fist spare a life? The truth is, we don't know for certain, but what we do know is that death was not automatic. If the losing gladiator fought bravely and honorably, the crowd often shouted for mercy, and the presiding official, usually a magistrate or emperor, could grant it. Sometimes, of course, death was the outcome. Gladiators who fought poorly, who broke the rules, or who were being punished, might not be spared. Public executions, especially of criminals or prisoners, were sometimes staged as part of the day's entertainment, often in more gruesome forms. But these were not the professional matches we think of when we picture two armored men circling each other in the dust. The mortality rate among gladiators varied by time and place, but studies of ancient records and grave inscriptions suggest that most gladiators survived multiple bouts. Some became famous, some retired, some even taught the next generation. So, where did the myth come from? Partly it comes from the spectacle itself. Rome loved theater, and gladiatorial combat was theater with real stakes. Writers, poets, and later historians often emphasized the drama, the spilled blood, the fallen heroes, the cruelty of the crowd. Over time, those dramatic accounts became dominant. And when Rome fell, later cultures, especially in the Christian world, used the games as a symbol of pagan decadence. They were remembered not as sport, but as savage entertainment. Then came the modern age. Paintings, novels, and eventually films amplified the myth. Gladiators became tragic symbols, always doomed. In Hollywood's retellings, from Spartacus to Gladiator, the arena is a place of death, and the crowd is always hungry for more. The image is powerful, the metaphor is clear, but it's only part of the story. To understand the truth, we must look beyond the edge of the blade. We must see the gladiator not only as a victim of Roman cruelty, but as a participant in a brutal but structured system. As an athlete, a performer, sometimes even a celebrity. And we must understand the arena not only as a killing ground, but as a stage, one where Rome displayed its values: courage, strength, discipline, endurance. The games were not simply about death. They were about control, over life, over fear, over the masses. They reminded Roman citizens of the power of the state, the glory of Rome, and the cost of rebellion. They satisfied the crowd's appetite for spectacle, but also reinforced a social order. And yet, it is the blood we remember, perhaps because it's easier. Death is clear, a final act, but survival, mercy, that complicates the story. As we step away from the echoing chambers of the Colosseum, we do so with a new understanding, not to cleanse the past, but to clarify it. The gladiators' world was violent, yes, but it was not chaos. It was ritualized, managed, and more often than not, it allowed the fighters to live to see another match. And we are left once again with a quiet question. How often do we remember the story that bleeds, and forget the one that simply walks away? From the sand-stained arenas of Rome, where myth met mercy and not every sword strike meant death, we now turn to another figure of war and legend, a name that echoes across centuries of conflict. In the Western imagination, he was once cast as the enemy, the barbarian at the gates. But as with so many others, the true Saladin is not found in the myth, but in the quieter folds of memory, where dignity and nuance often go overlooked. In the chronicles of the Crusades, few names loom larger than Saladin. To some, he is remembered simply as the Muslim leader who seized Jerusalem from Christian hands. To others, as a symbol of merciless conquest, an Eastern tyrant draped in cruelty, driven by fanaticism, opposed to all that was good and holy in Christendom. This image, sharpened over centuries, still lingers. A savage brute, a bloodthirsty adversary, the villain of the Crusader tale. But was Saladin truly the monster he was once made out to be? Or is this another distortion, born from the needs of propaganda, legend, and the desire to simplify a long and complicated war? Saladin, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, was born in 1137 in Tikrit, in what is now Iraq. He rose to prominence in a fractured Islamic world where dynasties competed and the memory of the First Crusade's bloody conquest of Jerusalem still burned. By the time he became Sultan of Egypt and Syria, Saladin had united much of the Muslim world under his command, preparing to push back against the Crusader states that had been carved into the Levant. But what set Saladin apart, then and now, was not just his military prowess, it was his character. The medieval battlefield was not known for restraint. Brutality was common on all sides, yet Saladin earned a reputation, even among his enemies, for mercy, discipline, and honor. When he recaptured Jerusalem in 1187, nearly a century after the Crusaders had stormed the city and slaughtered thousands, he forbade looting. He spared civilians. He allowed Christian pilgrims to leave or stay peacefully. He ransomed many prisoners rather than executing them. He even offered medical treatment to the wounded enemy and returned churches to Christian care. This was not the behavior of a brute. Even in the Western world, where the initial reaction to his victories was often fear and vilification, accounts of Saladin began to shift. Chroniclers who had once called him a barbarian began to record stories of his generosity, his humility, and his respect for Christian values. Richard the Lionheart, his chief adversary during the Third Crusade, grew to admire him. Though they never met in person, a kind of chivalric respect emerged between the two. When Richard fell ill, Saladin sent his personal physician. When the English king needed a horse, Saladin sent him two. This does not mean Saladin was a pacifist. He waged war, and at times he did so with severity. But he did not delight in cruelty. And where he could have chosen revenge, he often chose restraint. So how, then, did the myth of the savage Saladin take root? Much of it lies in the way history is told in wartime. During the Crusades, and for many centuries after, European storytellers had reason to demonize Saladin. He was the face of a powerful counter-crusade, a man who had taken Jerusalem from Christian hands. To galvanize support, to raise armies, and to justify violence, it helped to paint him in monstrous colors. And in the centuries that followed, especially during the age of colonialism, the West continued to cast Eastern leaders, especially Muslim ones, as violent, irrational, and dangerous. Saladin became part of that larger narrative, a representative of the other, used to reinforce the idea of Western moral superiority. But over time, something curious happened. Even within medieval Europe, Saladin began to be remembered differently. Poets and philosophers, especially during the Renaissance and Enlightenment, found in him a paradox. A Muslim ruler who embodied Christian virtues more than many Christian kings. By the 18th century, Saladin was sometimes held up as an example of honor, justice, and nobility. His myth, once darkened by fear, began to shine with a strange light. And yet for many, the old caricature remained. A simple story, easier to tell. A villainous figure in armor, riding across deserts, indifferent to suffering. But Saladin's real story, like the man himself, is far more layered. He was a devout Muslim, yes, but not a zealot. He was a conqueror, yes, but not a tyrant. He could be ruthless when necessary, but he also believed in diplomacy, in coexistence, in magnanimity. His legacy lives on in the Islamic world as a unifier and liberator, and increasingly in the West as a model of cross-cultural respect. What then does this evolving memory teach us? It reminds us that history is not only written by the victors, it is also rewritten by those who need villains, and that over time, even enemies can be remembered as human. That sometimes, when we look beyond the banners and borders, we find not monsters, but men. Men who prayed, who wept, who chose mercy when they did not have to. So as we step away from the smoke of war and the shouting of legends, we leave Saladin not as the brute some once claimed, but as a figure caught between myth and memory. One whose true legacy invites us to look more carefully, to judge more slowly. And we are left, once again, with a quiet question. How many other so-called enemies in our history books were never truly what we were told they were? From the battle-scarred hills of the Levant and the complicated figure of Saladin, we return now to a quieter kind of myth, one born not of war, but of invention, of glowing filaments, glass bulbs, and the dawning of electric light. A different kind of legend, etched not in blood or stone, but in textbooks and timelines. And like so many before, it too begins with a name we thought we knew. We are often taught, with clarity and confidence, that Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. The image is simple, familiar, almost iconic. A lone genius in a dusty workshop, tinkering late into the night. A spark, a glow. The first moment of light in darkness. A single mind turning the wheels of modernity. But history, once again, resists simplicity. Edison did not invent the light bulb. By the time he began experimenting with incandescent lighting in the late 1870s, the idea had already existed for decades. Other inventors, working in Britain, France, Germany, and the United States, had already developed electric lights. Some had even demonstrated working prototypes. What Edison did was not create the first light bulb, but refine it, improve it, and make it practical for widespread use. And in many ways, that distinction is just as important. The concept of electric light traces back to the early 19th century. In 1802, Humphrey Davy, a British chemist and inventor, created the first electric arc lamp by connecting a battery to a strip of carbon. It was blindingly bright and burned out quickly, but it marked the beginning. Over the following decades, inventors continued the pursuit. In 1841, Frederick de Molens received a patent for a bulb filled with inert gas and a platinum filament. In 1845, John W. Starr developed a light bulb using a carbon filament. In 1854, Heinrich Goebel, an obscure German-American mechanic, claimed to have produced a functional light bulb using a carbonized bamboo filament. And in 1874, two Canadian inventors, Henry Woodward and Matthew Evans, patented a design remarkably close to what Edison would later perfect. Edison was not unaware of these developments. In fact, he purchased the Woodward and Evans patent before launching his own experiments. What set him apart was not a single moment of discovery, but an extraordinary capacity to refine and systematize. He and his team tested thousands of materials for filaments, cotton, linen, even beard hair, before settling on carbonized bamboo, which could last for over 1,100 hours. But Edison's genius extended beyond the bulb itself. He understood that the invention of a long-lasting light source was only one part of the challenge. The true innovation lay in creating an entire system, a way to generate and distribute electricity on a scale large enough to light homes, streets, and cities. And so, in 1882, Edison opened the first commercial power station in New York City. With that, light was no longer a novelty. It was infrastructure. Why, then, has he been remembered as the inventor of the light bulb? Part of the answer lies in Edison's skill, not just as an inventor, but as a businessman and storyteller. He was a master of publicity, branding his laboratory as an invention factory and himself as the Wizard of Menlo Park. His name became synonymous with progress, ingenuity, and American innovation. And in the retelling of his life, many of the collaborative and cumulative aspects of invention faded into the background. The myth of the lone genius is compelling. It suggests that history is made by singular individuals, rare minds who pull the future into the present through sheer will and brilliance. It's a narrative that flatters the idea of individual greatness. But it often comes at the cost of erasing the broader community of thinkers, tinkerers, and laborers who made progress possible. Edison had a team. Dozens of assistants worked in his laboratories, many of whom contributed essential ideas and breakthroughs. Men like Francis Upton, Charles Batchelor, and Lewis Latimer, an African-American inventor who helped refine the filament and improve the bulb's durability, played crucial roles. And around the world, others were working on similar problems in parallel. So why do we still tell the story this way? Perhaps because it's easier. A single name. A single image. A light bulb switched on, and the world forever changed. It fits neatly into the way we prefer to understand history, not as a slow collective process, but as a series of sparks. It allows us to measure time in moments, before the bulb and after. And yet, when we look more closely, the truth is more interesting, because what Edison represents is not just invention, but evolution. Not a moment of brilliance in isolation, but the culmination of decades of effort, his and others. He didn't invent light, but he helped bring it into the lives of ordinary people. And in that, his legacy is no less remarkable. As we turn down the brightness of this familiar tale, we are reminded once again that historical myths often form not from lies, but from simplifications. From the need to remember something, even if that something is only part of the whole. So we sit, quietly, under the warm glow of a light not born in a single moment, but assembled piece by piece, across borders, across decades, across minds. And we're left, once again, with a quiet question. How often have we mistaken the one who finished the story for the one who first began to write it? From the gleam of invention and the myth of a glowing bulb to the shadows of medieval Europe, we step into a darker tale. One tangled in fear, folklore, and the enduring power of symbols. A story where blood and myth merge, and a man is remembered not for what he truly was, but for what he came to represent in our imaginations. For centuries, the name Vlad the Impaler has conjured visions of horror. A cruel prince perched atop a blood-soaked throne. Forests of corpses impaled on wooden stakes. A man so brutal, so inhuman, that stories claimed he drank the blood of his enemies. And over time, those whispers began to take root, until they grew into legend. Until they helped give birth to one of the most enduring figures in Western horror, Count Dracula. But beneath the myth lies a more complex truth. One woven through political chaos, cultural conflict, and the murky records of medieval history. Vlad III of Wallachia, also known as Vlad Tepes, or Vlad the Impaler, was born in 1431 in the region that is now part of Romania. His nickname, Tepes, came not from rumor, but from reality. Vlad did impale his enemies, often and brutally. It was a method of punishment, terror, and public spectacle. And in the violence of 15th century Eastern Europe, where warlords ruled and enemies were everywhere, such methods were both feared and, at times, respected. But did he truly drink blood? The idea is chilling, vivid, almost cinematic. But historians have long struggled to find any credible evidence for it. The accounts that describe Vlad as a blood drinker often come from hostile sources: German pamphlets, Saxon merchants, and Ottoman enemies who had every reason to demonize him. These tales were sometimes printed with lurid illustrations and exaggerated for effect, intended to shock, to scandalize, and, perhaps, to justify retaliation. One such pamphlet, published in the late 15th century, depicts Vlad dining among impaled bodies, dipping his bread in blood. Another claims he enjoyed watching people suffer while calmly eating his meals. But these sources are sensational, often inconsistent, and rooted more in propaganda than in fact. Is it possible that such a man might have indulged in ritualistic cruelty? In that time, yes. But to say that Vlad drank blood as a regular act is to step from historical ground into the world of metaphor and myth. So how did this image endure? Part of the answer lies in the region's turbulent past. Wallachia was a frontier land, caught between the Catholic West, the Orthodox East, and the expanding Islamic Ottoman Empire. It was a place of shifting allegiances, betrayals, and border wars. Vlad, as ruler, was shaped by this environment. He had been a hostage of the Ottomans in his youth. He had seen the fragility of power up close, and when he returned to claim his throne, he ruled with an iron hand. But brutality alone does not explain the myth. For that, we must look to the 19th century, specifically to Bram Stoker. In 1897, the Irish author published Dracula, a novel that would change popular culture forever. In his notes, Stoker came across the name Dracula, which in Romanian means son of the dragon, or son of Dracul. Vlad's father, Vlad II, had been a member of the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric order dedicated to defending Christianity. But in an era of growing fascination with the Gothic, the exotic, and the horrific, Dracula seemed to suggest something darker. There is no evidence that Stoker knew much about the real Vlad beyond the name, but the connection was made. And in time, Vlad the Impaler became fused with the fictional vampire, a man who not only killed his enemies, but consumed their very essence. The idea was irresistible. Blood as symbol, blood as fear, blood as power. And so the myth of the blood-drinking tyrant spread. Through films, books, documentaries, and Halloween masks, a real man, once embroiled in a regional power struggle, became the poster figure for a supernatural predator. But what is lost in this transformation? Perhaps it is the humanity, however dark and complicated, of a historical figure who lived in a brutal world. Vlad was not a vampire. He was a prince, a man shaped by political betrayal, personal trauma, and an unrelenting need to survive. He was neither hero nor monster, but something more familiar, a ruler navigating violence with violence, cruelty with cruelty. And while his methods were extreme, his story mirrors others from the same time, leaders who used terror not as madness, but as strategy. The myth of the blood drinker persists, in part, because it satisfies something primal. It gives us a clear villain. It turns history into legend. But real history is rarely so clean. It is filled with contradictions, with men who are both revered and reviled, who protect and destroy in equal measure. So we return, quietly, to Vlad, no longer the creature of the night, but the man of his century. And we ask, what happens when myth becomes memory? when a story soaks so deeply into culture that we forget to question it. In the shadows between truth and tale, Vlad the Impaler remains, neither fully man nor fully monster, but always, unmistakably, a mirror for the fears we carry and the stories we choose to believe. From the shadowed legend of Vlad and the blurred line between history and horror, we now turn to a different kind of invisibility. Not of one man made mythic, but of countless women whose stories have faded beneath the surface of our collective memory. Not because they were never there, but because for so long we simply weren't looking. For generations, we were taught that ancient warfare was a man's domain. Swords clashed, shields cracked, empires rose and fell, all under the banners of kings, generals, and soldiers. In this telling, women waited at home, far from the blood and fire of battle. They were nurturers, mourners, queens perhaps, but never warriors. The image is powerful, familiar, and incomplete, because the belief that women never fought in ancient battles isn't supported by history. It's shaped by how history was told, and what was left out. When we look closer, quietly and with care, we begin to find traces. Bones buried in forgotten fields, names half erased by time, myths that hint at something more. And suddenly, the silence surrounding ancient women in war begins to crack. Let's begin in the steppes of ancient Scythia, where Greek historians once described fierce female warriors who fought on horseback, wielding bows and spears with deadly precision. Herodotus, often called the father of history, wrote of a tribe where women hunted, rode, and killed just as the men did. He called them the Sauromatae. Others called them Amazons. For centuries, scholars dismissed these stories as legend, but modern archaeology tells a different tale. In burial mounds scattered across the Eurasian steppes, from Kazakhstan to southern Russia, graves have been unearthed containing skeletons of women buried with weapons, iron daggers, bronze arrowheads, and horse trappings. Analysis of their bones shows signs of riding, archery, and even battle injuries. These were not ceremonial burials. They were lives lived in war, and they are not alone. In ancient Britain, the so-called ivory bangle lady was buried in Roman times with luxurious grave goods and signs of high status. Though not a soldier herself, her very presence in such circles reminds us that women held complex roles in societies we once imagined as entirely male-dominated. In the Viking world, too, the myth is shifting. For a long time, scholars believed that women played no role in Norse warfare. But in 2017, a DNA study shook that assumption. A high-status warrior's grave in Birka, Sweden, long believed to be that of a man, was revealed through genetic testing to belong to a woman. She had been buried with weapons, 2 horses, and a gaming board, likely used for strategic planning. The discovery didn't just rewrite her story. It forced a quiet reevaluation of countless others. And then there's the example of the Trung sisters in ancient Vietnam, Trung Trac and Trung Nhi, who led a rebellion against Chinese occupation in 40 AD. Riding atop war elephants, they rallied thousands and temporarily freed the region from Han rule. Though eventually defeated, they were remembered for centuries as symbols of resistance. In Vietnam, they are not mythical. They are national heroines. Why then have so many of these women been forgotten? Part of the reason lies in the way history was recorded. Most ancient texts were written by men, elite, literate men, whose priorities often aligned with preserving patriarchal order. Stories of powerful women were inconvenient, threatening, or dismissed as anomalies. And when those women did appear, they were often recast as symbols, goddesses, temptresses, or tragic figures. It wasn't that women weren't there. It was that the lens through which we viewed the past filtered them out. Cultural expectations also shaped the narrative. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, when much of modern history writing took shape, ideals of femininity emphasized passivity, purity, and domesticity. The idea of a woman in armor didn't fit the script, and so, many examples of women in warfare were quietly ignored, misinterpreted, or romanticized into legend. Consider Boudica, queen of the Iceni, who led a revolt against Roman rule in what is now Britain. She's often portrayed as an exception, a furious outburst in an otherwise male landscape. But what if she wasn't an exception? What if she was part of a broader, now obscured tradition of female resistance? Even in ancient Egypt, some women took on martial roles. Queen Ahotep I was praised for rallying troops and quelling rebellion. And in classical India, texts speak of warrior queens who led armies and defended cities. But their stories are often clouded in metaphor, mythology, or religious framing, making it harder to extract the history beneath the legend. So the misconception that women never fought persists. Not because it's true, but because it was repeated, reinforced, taught in classrooms and echoed in movies. And over time, repetition became belief. But history, like the earth itself, keeps secrets. And over time, those secrets rise. With every excavation, every retranslated scroll, every grave reanalyzed with modern tools, we see the outlines of women who did not just observe history, they shaped it. On horseback, with sword in hand, in armor, on the battlefield. And perhaps the most humbling part is this. They were likely always there. We just hadn't been taught to see them. As the dust of centuries settles and we learn to look again, not just with fresh eyes, but with better questions, we begin to uncover not a new history, but a fuller one. And so we pause here in this unfolding journey of truth and ask ourselves, how many stories are still buried? How many warriors have we forgotten? Not because they lacked courage, but because we lacked the curiosity to find them. From the forgotten women of war who stood tall against the tide of time, we shift now to another figure misunderstood by modern imagination, the armored knight, a towering emblem of medieval might, often portrayed as noble, yet somehow clumsy. But was he really weighed down by his armor, slow and immobile, like a walking statue? Picture a medieval battlefield in your mind's eye. The sky is gray with smoke, the clang of swords rings through the air, and at the center of it all stands a knight, encased in glistening metal, towering and unyielding. We've seen him in films, in paintings, in storybooks, his limbs stiff, his steps heavy, needing help to mount a horse or even rise from the ground. The image is familiar. But is it accurate? For centuries, a common belief has clung to our collective understanding of the Middle Ages, that the armor worn by knights rendered them nearly immobile, that they waddled and wobbled, more sculpture than soldier. It's a striking idea, and an enduring one. But the truth, as it so often is far more flexible. To understand where this misconception began, we need to look at how armor has been portrayed, especially in the popular media of the 19th and 20th centuries. In early historical reenactments, actors wore replica suits that were often hastily assembled or overly heavy, not based on actual combat designs. These ill-fitting recreations made movement genuinely difficult, feeding the idea that real knights must have suffered the same fate. Later, museums began displaying suits of armor standing upright, rigid, often ceremonial versions made for display or for royal parades, not the battlefield. These armors were crafted for show, not speed. And once again, the myth grew. If they couldn't move in the museum, surely they couldn't move in war. But the historical record, and the evidence left behind, tells a different story. Surviving examples of battlefield armor, especially from the 14th and 15th centuries, reveal remarkable engineering. Crafted by skilled smiths who understood the delicate balance between protection and mobility, these suits were designed to move with the human body, not against it. A full suit of plate armor might weigh around 45 to 60 pounds. Surprisingly, that's comparable to the gear carried by a modern infantry soldier. But unlike a modern soldier's backpack, medieval armor distributed its weight evenly across the body, through the shoulders, hips, and limbs, allowing for balance, agility, and endurance. Knights trained from a young age not only to wear armor, but to thrive in it. They practiced wrestling, mounted combat, running, and even climbing. Manuscripts and fighting manuals from the period, such as the Fechtbücher of the German School of Fencing, depict armored men engaged in complex combat maneuvers, somersaults, and grappling techniques. These were not actions of immobilized warriors. Modern experiments have helped bring these truths to life. Historians and martial artists who have reconstructed medieval armor using traditional materials and methods have demonstrated astonishing feats, running up stairs, vaulting onto horses, executing rolls and tumbles, and engaging in long bouts of combat. In one well-documented demonstration, a fully armored reenactor did jumping jacks and cartwheels without hesitation. It's a far cry from the popular image of a knight needing a crane to get back on his feet. Why, then, did this myth endure? Perhaps it persisted because it fit so neatly into a narrative. The Middle Ages have often been depicted as a time of ignorance and excess, the Dark Ages, as they were once called. Imagining knights as walking tin cans reinforced the idea of a clunky, outdated world replaced by the grace and enlightenment of modern times. There's also the theatrical appeal. In films and television, exaggeration enhances drama. A knight struggling to lift a sword or stumbling in heavy armor makes for a more memorable visual than one moving with trained grace. Hollywood has shaped how we see history, even when the facts tell a different tale. And then, there is something psychologically powerful about the image itself. The idea of being trapped in armor, of being protected but also confined, resonates as a metaphor. Perhaps we held on to that idea because it mirrored something deeper. The tension between strength and vulnerability, between the roles we wear and the freedom we lose. Yet the truth is far more humanizing. These knights were not rigid golems of iron. They were athletes, warriors, trained professionals whose armor was the product of generations of craftsmanship, experience, and innovation. Their gear was expensive, tailored, and carefully balanced. And it was effective, not just at saving lives, but at enabling movement where it mattered most. As we look back, we're reminded once again that historical truth is often quieter than myth. It doesn't shout or dazzle. It waits in the corners, in manuscripts, in recovered artifacts, in quiet experiments done centuries later. And as we peel back these layers, myth by myth, we begin to understand not only the past more clearly, but the way we've chosen to remember it. So the next time we picture a knight standing on the field, sword drawn, eyes fixed on the horizon, perhaps we can also imagine him as he truly was, focused, agile, and very much alive within the armor that moved with him, not against him. From knights in motion to the quiet rituals of medieval kitchens, we now turn our gaze to something more humble, something red, round, and deceptively simple. A fruit that has carried a strange accusation for centuries. What if we told you that the tomato, today beloved in sauces, soups, and salads, was once feared, not for its taste, but for the death it supposedly brought? For many, the story goes like this. When tomatoes were first introduced to Europe, people believed they were poisonous, a deadly fruit from the New World, mistrusted and left to rot. It's an odd image. Villagers eyeing a tomato with suspicion, as if it were an apple from Eden, tempting but fatal. But where did this fear come from, And did it ever truly grip the medieval imagination? Let's begin with a simple, surprising truth. Tomatoes didn't even exist in medieval Europe. The fruit, native to western South America, was completely unknown to the continent until the early 1500s, after the voyages of Columbus and the Columbian Exchange began connecting the Old World to the New. By then, the Middle Ages had given way to the Renaissance, so, strictly speaking, no one in medieval Europe feared the tomato, because they'd never seen one. Still, the broader myth that tomatoes were once widely considered poisonous has a seed of truth. But like many enduring legends, it's tangled in half-truths, misunderstood science, and cultural hesitations. When tomatoes first arrived in Europe in the 16th century, they were met with a mix of curiosity and caution. Botanically, they belonged to the Solanaceae family, also known as nightshades. This group includes deadly plants like belladonna and henbane, which had long been associated with witchcraft, hallucination, and death. It's easy to imagine how, to the cautious eye of an herbalist or householder, the tomato's vibrant color and unfamiliar shape might have evoked mistrust. But the fear wasn't purely botanical. There was also the plate. In upper-class European households, food was often served on pewter plates. These were elegant but deceptive. Tomatoes, rich in natural acidity, could leach lead from the pewter. When this happened, those who dined on tomatoes might suffer from symptoms of lead poisoning, nausea, fatigue, even death. To the onlooker, the culprit wasn't the dish, but the fruit that sat upon it. A tomato served on a silvered surface might taste of luxury, and yet carry the seed of tragedy. So the tomato's poor reputation spread. But not everywhere. In southern Europe, especially in Italy and parts of Spain, the tomato found earlier acceptance. There, it was gradually incorporated into stews, sauces, and cooked dishes, often after long boiling, which lessened acidity. By the late 1600s, tomatoes were appearing in Neapolitan recipes, and by the 18th century, they had begun to charm the Mediterranean palate. Still, in much of northern Europe, tomatoes remained ornamental curiosities. Garden plants admired for their strange appearance, rather than eaten. In England, tomatoes were sometimes called love apples, pomme d'amour, and were grown more for their exotic novelty than their culinary value. But was there ever a moment when people truly believed a tomato bite would be fatal? There's little evidence of widespread panic or official proclamations declaring the tomato poisonous. The fear seems to have been more of a whisper, an ambient caution, rather than a consensus. A hesitation that lived in the margins of society, fueled by rumor, reinforced by anecdote, and passed quietly between generations. And yet, like many myths, it became louder over time. By the 19th century, as tomatoes became a staple in American cuisine, especially through the rise of Italian immigrant communities, older myths were revived, now cast as stories of triumph. They used to think it was poison, the tale would go, but now look at it. How far we've come. In a way, this narrative of fear and redemption helped elevate the tomato's status. It became more than a fruit. It became a symbol of progress, of knowledge overcoming ignorance, the red badge of the modern kitchen. So why does this myth still linger? Perhaps because it's satisfying. We like the idea that something once feared has become beloved. It makes us feel wiser, more enlightened than those who came before. It's a simple story that fits neatly into our view of history as a slow climb from darkness into light. Or maybe the myth survived because it resonates on a deeper level. There's something unsettling about beauty that might conceal danger. The tomato's bright skin, like a warning, its connection to poisonous cousins, its foreign roots in lands once deemed savage and wild. All these threads wove together into a tapestry of suspicion, one that didn't need to be official or widespread to survive. And yet, as we taste it today, on pizza, in pasta, in fresh summer salads, we rarely think about the centuries of misunderstanding behind it. History is full of these quiet corrections. Not grand reversals, but slow adjustments. One fruit, one idea, one perception at a time. We peel back the layers, and what we find is often less dramatic, but more human. We see not just a tomato, but the people who encountered it, their hesitations, their superstitions, their science, incomplete but evolving. We see how knowledge travels across continents, across time, and how myths grow in the spaces where facts are still forming. So the next time you slice into a ripe tomato, perhaps you'll pause for just a moment, not in fear, but in quiet recognition of how far the world has come and how many things we once believed that no longer hold true, and how many more still wait in the shadows, quietly asking to be seen differently. From whispers of poison in the kitchen gardens of early Europe, we now step into the charged air of revolution. A city on the brink, a prison with towering stone walls, and a crowd that would change the course of history. Few symbols stir the French imagination like the storming of the Bastille. But behind the fireworks and national pride lies a smaller, quieter truth, one that history has often dressed in grander robes than it deserves. From whispers of poison in the kitchen gardens of early Europe, we now step into the charged air of revolution. A city on the brink, a prison with towering stone walls, and a crowd that would change the course of history. Few symbols stir the French imagination like the storming of the Bastille, but behind the fireworks and national pride lies a smaller, quieter truth, one that history has often dressed in grander robes than it deserves. Chapter begins. To this day, Bastille Day is celebrated with military parades and street festivals across France. July 14th marks what is widely remembered as a moment of liberation, a people rising against tyranny, tearing down the walls of oppression, and opening the gates of a medieval fortress to release a flood of unjustly imprisoned souls. For many, it was the day the revolution truly began, and the day the people freed the masses. But what if there were no masses to be freed? What if, instead of hundreds of political prisoners, there were only a handful, and not quite the kind of captives we might imagine? Let's return to the heart of Paris. It's 1789. The air is thick with discontent. Bread is scarce, taxes are high, and the voices of the Enlightenment have filled cafes and pamphlets with visions of liberty, equality, and the rights of man. The people are restless. The king, Louis XVI, is indecisive. And the Bastille looms, both literally and symbolically, over it all. Built in the late 1300s as a military fortress, the Bastille gradually evolved into a state prison, its shadow lengthened by stories of secrecy and cruelty. It was the place where men disappeared, where dissenters were locked away without trial, condemned by a royal document known as a lettre de cachet. It stood not just as a prison, but as a metaphor for unchecked royal power. In the public mind, it was a dungeon for political prisoners, philosophers, and rebels, a place where truth itself could be shackled. And yet, by the summer of 1789, the Bastille was already fading. Its military significance had dwindled. Its walls, once feared, were largely symbolic. And the prisoners? On the morning of July 14th, there were exactly 7, not hundreds, not dozens, just 7. 2 of them were lunatics. One claimed to be Julius Caesar. Another was a forger. There was a young aristocrat imprisoned at the request of his own family, and among the rest, no famous political voices, no heroes of liberty awaiting rescue. When the gates were finally breached and the prisoners released, the crowd found not symbols of resistance, but confused, largely forgotten men, and silence where they had expected thunder. So why did the myth of a grand liberation persist? Part of it lies in the power of narrative. Revolutions need symbols. They need stories that are simple, bold, and easy to pass from voice to voice. The idea of the people storming a fortress to free the unjustly imprisoned is not only compelling, it's essential. It gives shape to the chaos, purpose to the uprising. It turns a confused crowd and an old fortress into something heroic. And the storming itself was dramatic. Over 900 Parisians gathered, demanding arms from the garrison and entry into the prison. Negotiations failed. Gunfire erupted. Cannons were rolled out. After hours of bloodshed, the fortress surrendered. Heads were paraded on pikes. The warden of the Bastille, Bernard-René Delaunay, was killed and dismembered by the crowd. It was a moment of both triumph and horror, a collective exhale after years of rising tension. In the immediate aftermath, newspapers and pamphlets turned the storming into legend. The Bastille, they claimed, had been a place of torture and repression. The prisoners were hailed as martyrs. Even Voltaire, who had been imprisoned there decades earlier, was invoked as a symbol of the revolution's righteous cause, even though he had died over a decade before the storming occurred. The story took on a life of its own. The Bastille became a canvas upon which a new France would paint its ideals. Its stones were pulled down, brick by brick, and distributed as souvenirs. Some were shipped across the Atlantic to George Washington as tokens of liberty. Others were carved into miniature models and passed from hand to hand. It was as though, by dismantling the Bastille, the people were dismantling centuries of silence and submission. And in a way, they were. Because the storming of the Bastille wasn't really about the prisoners inside. It was about the power outside. The people were not freeing men. They were freeing themselves. Still, the myth persisted, that masses were liberated, that chains were broken, that darkness was replaced by sudden light, and perhaps, in a symbolic sense, that was true. But historically, fact and feeling parted ways. As generations passed, the story solidified. Textbooks simplified it. Children recited it. The image of oppressed prisoners walking into sunlight became a symbol of what the revolution promised, even if it wasn't what truly happened that day. And maybe that's why the myth has endured. Because sometimes, in the middle of political upheaval, people need metaphors more than measurements. They need moments that feel true, even if the details are hazy. The storming of the Bastille became a story not of numbers, but of meaning. A story of hope rising over fear, of people tearing down what they could no longer bear. Today, Bastille Day is less about the prison and more about the people, about remembering what it meant to rise together, even if the prison held just 7 men. It's a reminder that history is not just made of facts, it's made of feelings, of stories told and retold until they shape the way we see the world. And as we look back on that July morning in 1789, perhaps the more interesting question isn't whether the Bastille held political prisoners, but why we needed to believe it did. From myths of revolution to the illusions of liberation, history often folds itself into neat stories. Clean lines drawn where the truth is more textured. And just as Bastille Day offered a romanticized break from tyranny, so too does another sweeping tale. That of a sudden light bursting forth after centuries of medieval darkness. We often hear it said in simple terms. That Europe, once bathed in the brilliance of ancient Rome, fell into a long, unlit slumber, the Dark Ages, only to be awakened centuries later by the Renaissance. A rebirth, a rediscovery of reason, beauty, science, and art. It's a powerful image, the flickering candle of civilization suddenly rekindled, glowing once again in the hands of thinkers like Leonardo, Galileo, and Michelangelo. But was it ever truly dark to begin with? The phrase Dark Ages evokes shadow and stagnation. It conjures a world devoid of culture, frozen in ignorance, waiting passively for Florence to bloom and for classical manuscripts to return from dusty oblivion. And yet, this view, though long popular in textbooks and common discourse, is itself a distortion, a simplification born not from malice, but from narrative convenience. So where did this idea begin? It wasn't coined by medieval people themselves. In fact, they saw their own age quite differently. The term Dark Ages comes from later thinkers, specifically Renaissance scholars who sought to distance themselves from what they viewed as a less enlightened past. The Italian poet Petrarch, writing in the 14th century, looked back at the years after Rome's decline and saw in them not continuity, but collapse. To him, the classical age was a golden beacon, and all that followed, a gloomy decline. And from this comparison, the myth took hold. But the truth is more gradual. The fall of Rome in the 5th century did not extinguish knowledge or creativity. It simply shifted its centers. Monasteries in Ireland copied ancient texts with care and reverence. In the Islamic world, cities like Baghdad and Cordoba became vibrant hubs of philosophy, astronomy, and medicine, preserving Greek thought and advancing it. Trade routes evolved, languages transformed, and far from being silent, the Middle Ages built cathedrals, mapped the stars, debated ethics, and laid the philosophical groundwork for what would later be called modern science. So why does the myth persist? Because the Renaissance, beautiful and revolutionary as it was, benefited from contrast. Its thinkers were deeply aware of their place in history. They saw themselves as inheritors of antiquity, shaking off the dust of intervening centuries. And in celebrating what they believed they had recovered, they also needed something to recover from. The Middle Ages became that backdrop, a foil to their brilliance. But is history truly a flick of a switch? The Renaissance was not a thunderclap. It was a slow and quiet dawn. Its roots stretch back into the so-called Dark Ages themselves, into the scholastic debates of the 12th century, the preservation of texts by Islamic scholars, the gradual rise of universities, and the reintroduction of Aristotle through translations made not in Florence, but in Toledo. Even art, so often held up as the Renaissance's great bloom, had long traditions reaching back to medieval mosaics and illuminated manuscripts. The very techniques that would one day adorn the Sistine Chapel were nurtured in churches across Europe centuries earlier. And what of science? Figures like Roger Bacon and Albertus Magnus, working in the 13th century, were already experimenting, classifying, and observing. The shift toward empirical thought didn't erupt, it evolved. But perhaps the myth endures because it is emotionally satisfying. There is comfort in the notion of progress as a narrative of resurrection, that after darkness comes light, that ignorance can be swept away by brilliance. And indeed, the Renaissance gave us wonders, a celebration of human potential, an explosion of art and thought. But it did not emerge from a void. By flattening the Middle Ages into shadow, we not only do a disservice to those centuries, we misunderstand the nature of human history itself. Progress is rarely linear. It does not leap. It meanders. It moves through quiet fields and forgotten halls just as often as it bursts through domes and paintings. The myth also reveals something about how we define value. The Renaissance favored a particular kind of beauty, classical symmetry, human anatomy, perspective. But does that make the intricate symbolism of a medieval tapestry less meaningful? The Gregorian chant less sublime than a polyphonic mass? The soaring arches of a Gothic cathedral any less miraculous than the dome of Brunelleschi? To say the Renaissance was a rebirth is not wrong, but to call what came before it dead is. The seeds of that flowering were planted in centuries often dismissed, their gardeners unnamed, their soil misunderstood. And so the story of light after darkness remains compelling, but incomplete. As we reflect on the long arc of European history, perhaps we are better served by dissolving the boundary between ages, by seeing not breaks, but bridges, not silences, but quieter conversations. And maybe, in the dim corridors of a so-called dark age, we find not absence, but incubation, a slower kind of brilliance, a light not extinguished, but waiting quietly for its next form. Just as history can miscast entire centuries as dark, it can also place blame too quickly on people, on cultures, or even on creatures too small to defend themselves. From narratives of rebirth to tales of ruin, we often find clarity where the past was far more complex. And in one of history's deadliest chapters, the story of blame begins not with emperors or armies, but with the quiet scurry of tiny feet. For generations, the tale has echoed through textbooks and classrooms with quiet certainty that the Black Death, the devastating plague that swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, claiming tens of millions of lives, was carried to villages and cities by mice. It's a striking image. The idea that something so small, so seemingly harmless, could be the unwitting agent of such immense suffering. In popular imagination, the story was simple. Infected rodents, stowing away in grain sacks or ship holds, spread death from port to port, town to town. Where they went, plague followed. But history is rarely that simple. The true culprit, it turns out, wasn't the mouse at all, but a close cousin, the black rat. And even then, the rat was only part of a more complex chain. For centuries, scholars believed that fleas living on these rats carried the bacterium Yersinia pestis, biting their hosts and then, in times of scarcity, turning to humans. It was a plausible explanation, elegant in its cause and effect simplicity. And for a time, it seemed enough. But as with so many chapters of the past, the deeper we dig, the more the soil shifts beneath our feet. Modern research has cast growing doubt on the neat narrative of rat, flea, and fatal bite. Some epidemiologists began to ask uncomfortable questions. Could the spread of the Black Death really have moved as fast and as widely as it did, if it were relying on flea-bitten rats alone? After all, rodents are limited in range, and fleas, though persistent, are hardly capable of leaping across continents in mere months. The more closely scientists examined the pattern of the outbreak, the more they noticed anomalies. Some towns experienced the plague without any visible signs of a rodent infestation. Others, especially in colder northern climates where rats were scarce, still saw widespread death. So what else could explain it? A new theory began to take shape, one that shifted the focus away from rats entirely and toward us, humans, specifically human fleas and body lice. Unlike the fleas that cling to rats, human ectoparasites travel with us, on clothing, on skin, in the folds of society itself. In an age where hygiene was a luxury and personal garments were worn for weeks without washing, these parasites moved freely from person to person across entire cities. If Yersinia pestis could be transmitted this way, through lice and human fleas, then the rapid, almost explosive spread of the Black Death becomes far more plausible. This model aligns better with the historical speed of contagion, especially in urban areas. It also helps explain how outbreaks occurred in places where rats were either rare or absent altogether. And yet, the image of the rat and the harmless mouse by association remained dominant. Why? Partly because it gave us something to point to, a scapegoat, a vessel for invisible fears. Mice and rats have long occupied uneasy places in our cultural imagination, symbols of dirt, disease, invasion. To place blame on them felt natural, even satisfying. The true terror of plague, its invisibility, its randomness, its silence, was harder to comprehend. Easier, perhaps, to blame a whiskered invader than to acknowledge that the threat might lie within our own homes, on our own skin. Over time, the myth solidified. It made its way into illustrations, into cautionary tales, into the very way we taught history to children. Rarely did we question why the mouse, specifically, took center stage, despite its minimal role. But there's another layer to this story. For in blaming rats or mice, we also overlooked something more troubling: how human decisions, living conditions, and societal structures enabled the devastation to flourish. Cities were overcrowded. Sanitation was poor. Quarantine measures, though attempted, were often inconsistent or too late. And fear, palpable, contagious, traveled just as fast as the sickness itself. The mouse became a symbol not just of the plague, but of our refusal to face deeper truths. And yet the true history of the Black Death continues to evolve. Advances in DNA analysis have allowed scientists to extract and examine Yersinia pestis from medieval burial grounds, confirming the presence of the bacterium but raising further questions about how exactly it spread, and whether multiple strains or methods of transmission were at play. Some researchers have even argued for a possible airborne component, given how quickly entire households or towns succumbed. Others point to environmental shifts, climatic changes, and human migration patterns as key drivers. What emerges is not a single story, but a web, a tapestry woven from biology, climate, culture, and chance. So where does that leave the mouse? Perhaps it was never truly the villain. Perhaps it was a shadow miscast by the need for answers, a whisper of blame that echoed more easily than the truth. In re-examining this simple image, mice causing plague, we are reminded that history is built not only on facts, but on fears, metaphors, and the human hunger for meaning. And maybe, in peeling back these layers, we glimpse something more enduring, that the past, like the present, is a conversation, constantly revised, reinterpreted, and rediscovered. Because the real story of the Black Death is not just about rats or fleas or even bacteria. It's about how we understand catastrophe, how we explain the unexplainable, and how, centuries later, we still search for clarity in the shadows of the past. History often clings to images, vivid, visceral, and unforgettable. From the shadows of disease and the myths of ancient violence, we move now to another story passed down in books, in classrooms, in whispers around campfires and pages of poetry. A tale not just of death, but of spectacle. The kind that stains memory in crimson tones. It's an image that feels pulled from the very heart of war-torn legend, that during the fiercest battles in human history, the slaughter was so immense, so unrelenting, that nearby rivers ran red with blood. That the cost of conflict wasn't only etched in the silence that followed, but in the very color of the water, transformed from clear to crimson. It's a powerful thought, one that evokes awe and sorrow in equal measure. The idea that the land itself, overwhelmed by death, could bleed. From the Battle of Antietam in the American Civil War to the fields of Agincourt, from the slaughter at the Somme to stories of Roman conquest, the imagery returns again and again, rivers, brooks, and creeks, turning red as thousands fell. But did it ever truly happen? The short answer, quietly and without fanfare, is no, not in the way the stories suggest. The more we examine this striking claim with scientific scrutiny, the more we find that it lives not in chemistry but in metaphor. Because while blood was certainly spilled, and in terrifying quantities, it's unlikely that any natural river or stream ever turned truly red with it. To understand why, we begin with a simple truth of biology. A human body contains about 5 liters of blood. In battle, especially ancient and pre-modern warfare, not all of that blood would be immediately lost. Much remains within the body even after death, unless deliberately drained. Now consider the scale of even the largest river, flowing water, ever diluted and replenished. It would take hundreds of thousands of gallons of blood, all pouring at once into a confined space, for a river to visually shift from blue or brown to red. Blood disperses rapidly in moving water. Its color fades. The concentration becomes invisible to the eye long before the water takes on the hue of myth. So how did we come to believe this story? Perhaps because the battlefield doesn't just mark the earth, it marks the imagination. Writers, poets, and chroniclers of war have long sought language powerful enough to convey the horror they witnessed. The river ran red becomes not a fact, but a feeling, a cry, a way of articulating the unbearable. Ancient historians were no exception. Roman authors often described entire plains soaked with blood, exaggerating death tolls and dramatizing nature's response to human violence. In the chaos of combat, streams muddied with dirt, blood, and the trappings of war may have seemed, in fleeting moments, tinged with crimson. To the soldiers fighting knee-deep in mud and death, perception became poetry, and poetry became legend. In the 19th century, this image gained new strength, partly due to the rise of journalism and the romanticization of war. Painters, too, embraced the metaphor. In depictions of Waterloo, Gettysburg, and Verdun, we see rivers shimmering red under darkened skies. Not because it was true, but because it felt true. The phrase entered language as something symbolic, a way to measure the unbearable toll of war in visual terms. But symbols are slippery things. Over time, metaphor hardens into memory, and what began as an expression of scale, of emotional devastation, becomes misunderstood as physical truth. And yet, despite the exaggeration, the myth persists. Why? Because there's something hauntingly human about imagining nature reacting to human violence. That the earth itself, passive and neutral, might momentarily seem to mourn with us. That water, so often a symbol of life, could be touched by death. It gives the battlefield a second witness. It also tells us something deeper about how we remember. In the aftermath of war, when the names of the dead are too many to count and their faces lost to time, we lean on imagery to preserve the impact. Not facts, not measurements, but visions. And in that sense, the blood-red river is not a lie. It is a vessel of grief. Still, the danger of accepting metaphor as truth is that it can distract from the real horrors. War does not need rivers turned red to be horrifying. The truth, the silence of mass graves, the unmarked pain of survivors, the slow decay of shattered towns, is more haunting than any poetic flourish. Perhaps the myth also allows us to compress vast suffering into a single image. Easier to say the river turned red than to list the names of 10,000 fallen. Easier to imagine nature recoiling than to acknowledge how we, ourselves, repeat the same patterns of destruction. And so the myth lives on, in novels, in films, in whispered legends of distant fields. The names of the rivers change: the Jordan, the Marne, the Tiber, the Thames. But the crimson current flows the same in each retelling. There may have been pools of blood, soaked earth, and shallow waters disturbed by the violence. But the river, in truth, remained itself, unchanged, flowing, moving on, quiet reflection to close. Perhaps then the most enduring truth is not that blood turned rivers red, but that memory does. That when we reach back through time to recall our darkest moments, we don't reach for statistics or soil samples. We reach for something more human, something that feels like mourning wrapped in metaphor. And maybe, in recognizing that, we come a little closer to the real history. Not the one gilded with spectacle, but the one quietly echoing beneath it. Because history is not always what happened. It is often what we needed to believe. From the flowing blood of legendary rivers to the vivid stories we dress history in, it becomes clear that what we see is often shaped by layers of time and imagination. And now, we turn to a familiar vision of antiquity. The figures of ancient Greece, garbed in stately white robes, embodying philosophy, democracy, and art. But what if the toga-clad image is not quite what it seems? Close your eyes and picture an ancient Greek. Perhaps you see a figure draped in billowing white fabric, a toga wrapped elegantly across the shoulder, sandals on the feet, and a laurel wreath resting atop the head. This image has been etched deeply into our cultural consciousness. It graces the walls of museums, the pages of textbooks, even Hollywood's silver screen. The toga is the unspoken uniform of ancient Greece. But here lies the twist. The toga was not a Greek garment. This is a misconception rooted in conflated history. The toga, as it is known, is distinctly Roman, a symbol of Roman citizenship, law, and public life. It was a large semicircular piece of cloth wrapped in complex folds around the body, worn exclusively by male Roman citizens during formal occasions. Its presence was a mark of identity and status, and its usage was strictly codified. Ancient Greeks, on the other hand, wore different clothing entirely. The quintessential Greek garment was the chiton, a simple rectangular piece of cloth, often linen or wool, fastened at the shoulders with pins or brooches, and gathered with a belt at the waist. The length and style of the chiton could vary by region, gender, and occasion, but it was generally lighter, more breathable, and less elaborate than the Roman toga. Additionally, men might wear the himation, a cloak draped over one shoulder and wrapped around the body, or the peplus, a garment more common among women. These garments were versatile, allowing ease of movement under the Mediterranean sun. So, how did the toga become so firmly associated with the Greeks in popular imagination? The answer lies in the enduring influence of Roman culture and its legacy. When Rome rose to dominance, it absorbed and adapted much from the Greeks: art, philosophy, literature, religion. However, in the realm of dress, Rome developed its own sartorial language, one that the Romans prized as uniquely theirs. As Rome expanded, its culture spread far and wide, shaping how subsequent generations perceived antiquity. In the Renaissance and Enlightenment eras, as Europeans rediscovered classical antiquity, Roman culture, its laws, architecture, and political ideals, became especially admired. Artists and scholars favored Roman models, and the toga became a potent symbol of civilization and citizenship. Since Romans themselves had borrowed extensively from the Greeks, the lines blurred for many later viewers, who merged the two ancient cultures into one classical image. Art and literature reinforced this merging. Paintings, sculptures, and theatrical productions often depicted figures wearing togas in scenes set in Greece or inspired by Greek myth, further cementing the visual connection. The toga became shorthand for ancient, regardless of which ancient culture was meant. Cinema and media have only continued the tradition. From early silent films to modern epics, the toga is rarely absent in depictions of Greek philosophers, statesmen, and warriors. The simplicity of a single recognizable garment helps audiences immediately identify ancient times, though often at the expense of accuracy. But why does this matter? Because clothing is not just fabric, it's identity. It speaks of culture, geography, climate, social structure, and values. By flattening the distinction between Greek and Roman dress, we risk losing sight of the rich diversity that once existed in the ancient world. We lose a layer of understanding about who these people were, their daily lives, their customs, their differences. It also reminds us how history is often shaped by the perspectives and priorities of those who tell it. Roman history and culture have long been the focus of Western education and celebration, sometimes overshadowing the equally complex and fascinating history of the Greeks. The toga stands as a symbol of that bias, quietly shaping our imagination of antiquity. In rediscovering the garments of ancient Greece, we open a window into a world that was vibrant, varied, and alive in ways that a single fabric cannot capture. We see the lightness of a chiton fluttering in the Aegean breeze, the simplicity of a peplos worn by a woman attending the Eleusinian mysteries, the practicality of a himation thrown over the shoulder of a philosopher walking the streets of Athens. These garments, like the people who wore them, were part of a culture that celebrated balance, proportion, and harmony, not only in thought, but in dress. And so, as we step away from the folds of the Roman toga, we begin to see history more clearly, not as a single image or symbol, but as a tapestry woven from many threads. Each garment, each fabric, each stitch tells a story. What other images, we might wonder, have been folded and refolded through time until their origins are lost? And how might our understanding of the past deepen when we begin to unravel them? Perhaps in shedding the toga and embracing the chiton, we glimpse not just ancient fashion, but the evolving way history itself dresses our memories.